Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we journey north into a world of ice and fire, gods and giants, where the sky itself was once carved from a giant's skull. This is the entire story of Norse mythology, a tale that begins in the void of Ginnungagap and stretches all the way to the fiery twilight of Ragnarok. We'll meet Odin, who sacrificed his eye for wisdom, Thor with his thunderous hammer, and Loki, the trickster who could not be trusted, yet was always needed. We'll travel across 9 worlds, from Asgard to Midgard, from the roots of Yggdrasil to the shadowed halls of Hel. Along the way, we'll discover how the Norse imagined the beginning and end of all things, and how their stories wove together the fierce beauty of their world. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? Whether you're here to relax, to drift into sleep, or to simply wander through the old tales, I'm glad you're with me. Now, let's begin. Before land or sky or the measured tick of time, there was Ginnungagap, the yawning space. To the north brooded Niflheim, a realm of mist and bitter frost where the ancient spring Livergulmir sent out cold rivers called Elivaga. To the south burned Muspelheim, a land of living flame under the guardianship of the fire giant Surtur. When the breath of heat drifted into the gulf and met the rime that blew from the north, the frost began to melt and to drip. From those lively drops came the first living being, vast and heavy and drowsy with ancient strength. His name was Ymir, whom the giants also called Orgelmir. Ymir was not a god. He belonged to the race that would one day stand against the gods, the family the poets call the Frost Giants. He lay down to sleep in the newborn dark, and, from his sweating armpits, a man and a woman grew full-formed. From the union of his 2 feet came a son, which tells you as much about Norse frankness as it does about Norse cosmology. In that first family tree there were no weddings or halls or laws, only the impersonal fertility of a world that had barely learned how to be alive. Heat and cold continued their quarrel in the void. From the rime that did not turn into giants there rose a second and gentler creature, the primeval cow Audhumla. Her hide glistened with frost. 4 rivers of sweet milk streamed from her udder, and on this milk Ymir fed, a child of ice kept alive by a mother of snow. Audhumla herself needed food, and she found it by licking the salt that lay within the frozen blocks around her. It was slow work and deliberate, like sculpture performed by a tongue. On the first day of licking there came a tuft of hair from the ice. On the second day, a head emerged. On the third, a whole man stood free, tall and stately. This was Beri, the first of the Aesir line. Beri fathered a son named Bor. Bor took as wife the giantess Bestla, daughter of Bolthorn, whose name means evil thorn. Out of that unlikely union came 3 sons who will soon rule the stories to come. They were Odin, Vili, and Ve. Their birth marks the arrival of purpose. Where Ymir embodies bulk and blind growth, and where Audhumla is life in its patient animal form, the 3 brothers bring will and craft and decision. In them, the Norse imagination moves from the undirected fertility of the beginning to the deliberate work of mind and hand. We should pause over the balance of these origins, because Norse myth never pretends that order was easy, or that it belonged to any one side. The first cow is not of divine courtly stock. The first giant is not evil through and through. The gods arise from a marriage between a son of the first god and a daughter of the first giant. The world is a mixed household from the start, the children of mist and the children of flame sharing a cradle. That is why the poems speak with such confidence about the inevitability of conflict. Kinship binds friend to foe even before the first spear is lifted. Ymir, meanwhile, kept begetting the frost giant race, and with it came the hint of threat. He is a reservoir of raw matter. He is not wicked in a modern moral sense, but he is dangerous in the old practical sense, a force that can drown fields simply by rolling over in his sleep. The three brothers grew and watched and learned. They looked out across Ginnungagap, Gap, where sparks flew from Muspelheim and settled on the breath of the north, and they understood that power unused is as wasteful as famine. The sources that preserve these tales speak with a plain force that suits their subject. In the poem of the seeress, the beginning is a void that gaped. In the lore of the skalds, the cow licks salt from rime for 3 days, and a patriarch steps out of the ice. We are meant to feel the strangeness and the simplicity at once. Nothing is yet measured by a sun that rises and sets. Days are counted by the rhythm of a tongue against a block of salt. Family starts not with vows in a hall, but with sweat and stone. From these few figures, the whole story will unfold. Ymir will be the source of substance. Audhumla is the provider who keeps the first life alive until something more self-sufficient can stand. Beri and Bor are the thin, bright line that leads to Odin and his brothers, and through them to craft, to speech, and to the ordering of things. We end this first movement at the moment just before the decisive act, with the giants multiplying in the dark and the three young gods looking upon the world as a work that waits for a maker. The three brothers looked upon an unfinished cosmos and chose to act. They confronted Ymir, the ancestor of giants, not because he was malicious, but because he was vast and unchecked, a living storehouse of matter without measure or mind. Their attack shattered the stillness that had filled Ginnungagap since the first thaw. When Ymir fell, his blood poured out in torrents and became the oceans, a flood so great it drowned nearly all his kin. One giant named Bergelmir climbed upon a luda, a kind of chest or boat, with his wife, and escaped to the far rim of creation. From that pair, the later giants descended, and thus enmity survived the deluge. From Ymir's flesh, the brothers pressed the land into being. His bones rose as mountain ranges, his teeth and shattered jaw became cliffs and scree, and from the fragments of his broken limbs came boulders scattered across valleys. They flung his skull high above and made of it a vault. To keep that sky from falling, they stationed 4 dwarfs at its corners and gave them names that are maps. Nordri stood to the north, Sudri to the south, Ostri to the east, and Vestri to the west. Within that dome they set the ornaments of heaven, taking sparks from the fires of Muspelheim and kindling them as stars. The drifting tissue of Ymir's brain they let loose as the clouds, which is a Nordic way of saying that even our weather is the slow thought of a dead giant. The brothers did not bring light only for beauty. They measured time. They took Sol, whom the poems speak of as a radiant young woman, and set her to steer a chariot that carries the Sunday. 2 horses draw it, Arvaka and Alsvid, and a shield named Svalin rides before the team so that the world does not burn. They took Mani, who tends the phases of the moon, and set him on his own path. Mani is said to carry with him 2 children, Bil and Huki, whom he took from a well on a winter night while they were bearing a pail across a pole. To explain the daily terror of eclipse and the ceaseless passage of days, the poets add another layer. Wolves, Skol, and Hati chase the sun and the moon across the sky. When the year grows old enough, the wolves will bite, but for now their pursuit simply keeps the chariots moving. Night and day were also given form, so that people would know when to rest and when to stand to their work. Night is a woman of giant blood named Not, dark and wise, who rides a horse called Hrimfaxi. From its bit foams the dew that lies on the fields each dawn. Day is her son by a god named Delling, and he rides Skinfaxi, whose mane lights the sky each morning. In this way, the Norse imagination sets rhythm in a world that had only recently learned to beat a pulse. Order on earth required shelter as well as calendars. From the eyebrows of Ymir, the brothers built a strong enclosure around the new land of men. They called it Midgard, the middle enclosure, a ring wall between the safe fields and the untamed edges of the world. Beyond that barrier stretched the cold reach of Jotunheim, where the giants would gather again. Between these two realms, a boundary forest grew thick and dangerous, a reminder that the line between kin and foe was drawn by necessity rather than disgust. Later, the gods would lay a road in the sky, a shimmering bridge men call the rainbow, and the Skalds call Bifrost, to link their own high realm with the middle lands. But for now, the wall of eyebrows and the wash of ocean marked the limits of humankind. The gods also confronted a problem beneath the ground. From Ymir's decaying flesh came creeping things. The brothers took pity, or perhaps found use, and they shaped the maggots into a race of small folk with minds and speech. These became the dwarfs. They live in stone halls and caverns, and spend their long years practicing the crafts that bind the world together. Old lists give their names in rapid chains that sound like hammers on an anvil. Among them are Dvalin and Althiof and Modsognir, who rule in the deep places. Time will show that the greatest treasures of the gods flow from their forges. In this first chapter of making, they are chiefly the hinge points and corner posts that keep the sky from sagging and the earth from coming apart. With heaven steadied and earth in place, the brothers turned their attention to beings who could walk upon the shore and look up at the new stars. On the sand by the sea, they found 2 trunks of wood, 1 ash and 1 elm, worn smooth by the water. From these they carved the first man and the first woman. They named them Ask and Embla. Odin bent close and breathed into them the spirit that lets flesh rise and speak. Vili gave them mind and the quickness that awakens in the eye. V granted them shape and voice and the power to hear and to feel. In some tellings, the gifts are counted slightly differently, with breath and wit and goodly color, but the meaning holds. They were made alive and aware and fair to look upon. The gods set Ask and Embla within Midgard, inside the wall that keeps the sea of Ymir's blood at bay. In that circle they would build halls and make laws and marry and grieve and sing, and in time they would people the earth with many tongues. The brothers then fixed the measures by which life should be kept. They set the course of the sun so that summer would not swallow the year, and they set the course of the moon so that winter would not last forever. They taught men how to count nights by the faces of Mani, and to know the passing of seasons by the tilt of light on the horizon. The poets speak also of summer and winter as persons with fathers of different temper. Summer comes from a kindly sire whose name means pleasant wind. Winter is born from a father whose name suggests biting cold. It is a way of saying that weather is kin to character, that the land itself has moods that must be respected. Not everything was security and neat measure. The gods understood that the new world sat poised between long memory and quick forgetting. They therefore appointed stewards over fresh-made places. Wells bubbled under roots that would soon be named, and creatures took their stations. An eagle settled into the high air, and something ancient gnawed at the hidden roots of the earth. A small squirrel ran messages that were mostly insults, which is a Skald's way of saying that even in ordered worlds there is gossip, and even gossip leaves marks. These touches belong to the larger map that will unfold in the next chapter, but they belong here as well because they show the makers working with an eye toward balance. They do not erase strangeness. They give it a place. There is one more detail that belongs to the making as the Norse tell it. The gods walked over their work and gave names to things. They named the morning and the evening, the midday and the midnight, the weeks and years, the fields and streams. To name is to bind. It is also to honor. Where other traditions pour sugar on the first loaf, the Norse pour words. Once spoken, the names settle on the earth like a net of meaning. Under that net, men can plant, and poets can remember. Thus the three brothers turned raw bulk into a world that breathes. They did not create from nothing. They cut and set and measured. They restrained and gave passage. They turned a corpse into a country, a skull into a roof, a breath into a people. What followed would depend on vigilance and craft as much as on force, for the giants lived still beyond the wall, and wolves already tested the edges of the sky. But for the first time there was a place where men could stand, and a calendar by which they could keep their promises. At the heart of everything stands an ash, whose crown touches the sky, and whose roots drink the oldest waters. The poets call it Yggdrasil. Its trunk is not a mere column of wood, but a living axis. The sap that moves in it is the quiet current that keeps creation together. When men say the worlds are 9, what they mean is that 9 distinct realms cling to this tree the way bees cluster on a branch. It is not a symbol only. It is habitat, roadway, law, storehouse, and drum. When it shivers, fate shivers. When it flourishes, the world is steady. 3 roots hold Yggdrasil firm. Each runs to a different quarter of existence and sinks into a different well. One root reaches to the plain, where the gods sit in council. There the Norns keep watch beside the well of fate. Their names are Erd for what has been, Verdandi for what is becoming, and Skuld for what is owed. They do not weave on a loom in the tidy way of later tales. They carve on wood, they score on living bark, they draw water and mix it with a white clay that shines, and they paint the trunk so it will not split. Around them stands sand and green turf that never withers, because they bless it daily with that water. From their bench of roots the gods receive justice and time itself, for no oath holds and no promise lasts unless the Norns have allowed it to be written into the grain of the world tree. A second route runs outward to a land of stone and frost where giants keep their counsel. Beneath that route lies the Well of Mimir. It is a dark mirror that remembers every thought that has ever been worth keeping. Odin once came there and paid for a single drink with an eye. The price tells you the value of what is stored in that water. In later seasons, Odin keeps Mimir's head with herbs and spells and carries questions to it. But the head is only the portable part of a deeper wisdom that belongs to the root and the well together. When the All-Father leans over that water, he sees not flattery but measure. He understands that holding the center requires harsh bargains, and that the keeper of memory is often silent. The third route dives down into a realm of mist where cold streams are born. There the well called Hivergelmir boils and smokes, and around it creep many snakes that are slow and patient. The greatest among them is Nidhogg, who chews at the root with a hatred that never tires. He is not a simple villain. He is the necessary appetite of endings. He reminds the living that wood is edible, and that even sacred ash is still ash. From that underroot come the waters that feed the first rivers, and from those rivers come fog, rain, and the dew that beads on the grass at morning. In some songs, the droplets that fall from Yggdrasil are called honeydew and are food for bees. The image is exact. From the high crown sweetness springs, but from the black root acid works as well. Growth and rot cooperate. Yggdrasil is not empty. It houses a nation of creatures that are at once ordinary and emblematic. An eagle perches at the topmost bough and looks out beyond sight. Between the eagle's eyes sits a hawk named Vedrfolnir, as if the sky needs a sky within it for sharper notice. On the bark scampers a squirrel, Ratatosk, a busy courier whose messages are insults carried up and down the trunk. He bears the petty malice that travels in every court, and like all gossip he leaves scratches wherever he runs. Among the branches 4 stags browse at the leaves. Their names are Dain, Dvalin, Dunar, and Durathror. They are the appetite of the forest measured out in hooves and horn. Their teeth are the small abrasion that fits the greater gnawing at the roots. In the roots, not only nidhogg, but a whole tangle of serpents keep to their work. The tree is fed and bitten at the same time. That is why the poets insist that Yggdrasil suffers more than men know. From the house of the gods, there is a daily movement toward the first root. The Aesir ride out to sit in judgment near the Well of Fate. Old verses list their horses by name, bright-hooved animals with ringing syllables, and say that Thor wades on foot through swift rivers rather than cross the Rainbow Road, in part to spare that bridge the weight of thunder. The scene is precise. The gods do not drift. They keep appointments. They sit beneath boughs and settle lawsuits, and the tree listens as men do. Law in this telling is not a set of cold tablets, but a living arrangement beneath living shade. The crown of Yggdrasil catches light that was first stolen from Muspelheim and set as sun and stars. Leaves spread in layers that are more architectural than random. In some accounts, a stag named Eikthirnir stands on the roof of Odin's hall and nibbles at a tree called Leirada. From his antlers drips water that flows down to Hervogelmere. Scholars argue whether Leirada is another name for Yggdrasil or a neighbor tree on the same sacred hill. The point for the story is that the economy of heaven closes its loops. What is eaten above becomes a spring below. What is drunk at the root becomes sap and then leaf again. That is not an allegory only. It is the way a farm works and the way a cosmos breathes. Yggdrasil also serves as a road and a boundary. Travelers climb and descend along its hidden ladders. Odin rides his 8-legged horse across unseen paths that bend with the boughs. Valkyries carry the fallen along routes that seem like wind and are really branches. Dwarfs, who prefer stone caverns, still reckon their halls by how far they lie from the nearest root. Elves favor the light that filters through its crown and make glades beneath it that are bright as the inside of a pearl. The giant folk see the trunk as a wall that needs testing, and they test it often. Every crossing of a border in these tales is a crossing of bark. The health of the tree is a public matter. When it thrives, fields bear, ships return, and children are born at the right time. When beetles strip a patch of bark, when snakes chew faster, when the Norns are hindered by some affront and cannot tend the trunk, then you will hear of blighted harvest and sick herds. The poets put it simply. The ash groans. It stands there and speaks without words. Even the gods cannot pretend not to hear. In the far future, the ash will shake so hard that everyone will understand the warning. Not yet. For now, the Norns still sprinkle the white water, still mend the surface, still advise the gods who come to sit in the shade. The name of the tree carries a story. Yggdrasil means the steed of the terrible one. Ygr is a title of Odin that admits he can frighten as well as inspire. Drasil is a word for horse. The phrase remembers a terrible initiation when Odin offered himself to himself and hung for 9 nights on the windswept tree to find the runes. In that ordeal, the tree became a mount that carried a man beyond himself. The name remained as a sign that this ash is not gentle furniture. It is a structure that can hold a god in pain and can deliver him into knowledge. The runes cut from that moment are not mere letters. They are little contracts with the world tree, strokes that tell wood and water to behave for a time. There is doctrine folded into this living thing. The center is not a throne with steps of marble. It is a plant that requires care. Fate is not a blind wheel. It is 3 women who keep the bark from splitting and keep the calendar from stalling. Evil is not a cartoon. It is an old dragon that does not stop chewing because you prefer to sing. Hope is not a slogan. It is water drawn up from a clear well and poured again on the same rough trunk every morning before the gods sit to judge. In that pattern, men recognize their own tasks. Feed what feeds you. Name what you tend. Accept that some part of the work will always be repair. Thus Yggdrasil stands, a vast ash that binds wells to weather, lore to leaf, and memory to breath. The 9 realms take their bearings from its roots and boughs. The bridge of colors touches one limb like a ribbon. The halls of gods and the caves of dwarfs and the fields of men all look toward it when they speak of center. The story will soon step off its branches to walk those realms one by one. But the tree must be understood first, because every journey in this mythology is a journey along its wood. The map of the Norse universe is not a tidy ladder of heavens and hells. It is a living arrangement set upon and within the great ash. Scholars speak of 9 realms, yet the poems are careful to leave room for mystery. Paths do not always run straight. Borders drift like mist over a marsh. What matters most is relation. Each realm holds its function and temperament. Together they make a working cosmos that rewards courage, reveres oath, and remembers debt. Asgard sits in the high reaches where the air is clear and the ground rings with iron shoes. It is the stronghold of the Aesir, the court where law and war and poetry share the same table. On the field called Idavol, the gods meet in council. There stands Gladsheim, the many-benched hall of judgment, and near it Valaskjalf, where Odin's silver roof catches the light. From the high seat named Halidskjalf, Odin looks out and sees the doings of worlds. Valhalla rises there as well, with its 540 doors and rafters of spears, a hall for chosen warriors who spend their days at sport and their nights feasting beneath shields that gleam like fish scales. Heimdall keeps watch at Himinbjorg by the foot of the Rainbow Road. His hearing is said to be so keen he can catch grass growing and wool thickening on a sheep. Asgard is not an idle paradise. It is a camp that trains for fate. Vanaheim lies at the same height in a different quarter. It is the home of the Vanir, gods of sea swell, fertile field, and wise treaty. The peace after the First War bound Aesir and Vanir in kinship, and that union is written into the topography. Njord keeps to the shore in a hall called Noaton, where the sound of oars and the smell of pitch are constant neighbors. Frey, lord of fruitful weather and good seasons, moves easily between Vanaheim and Asgard. Freya brings the art of Seder and presides over a field called Folkvang, where the best among the fallen share her hospitality. Vanaheim is the realm that speaks softly and grows abundantly. Its power is patient, and its authority is kept through gifts and fairness rather than iron. Alfheim is a bright reach where the light seems to come from within leaves as much as from any sky. The light elves dwell there, beings described as fairer than the sun to look upon. They are quick to music and deft at craft that belongs to living things rather than to metal or stone. Older verses say that Alfheim was given to Freya as a tooth gift when he first came of age, a sign that prosperity and gentle increase should have a seat among the gods. In stories where human beings encounter elves, there is always a hush, as if the air were kneeling. Alfheim teaches that beauty is not a luxury, but a duty, and that grace is a kind of law. Midgard holds the middle. Its wall is built from the eyebrows of the primal giant, and its moat is the ocean that spilled from his veins. Men live here, and their works are short and earnest. The serpent Jormungandr circles the rim with tail in mouth, a living belt that both threatens and protects. In Midgard, men learn measure. They look up to count nights by the calm face of Mani, and days by the bright stride of Sol. They look outward to gauge weather, and to judge when to sow and when to harvest. They look inward to keep faith, since law without memory is only noise. The gods walk here often, not only to show favor, but to test whether men are still worth the trouble of a wall. Jotunheim stretches across cold mountains and iron rivers. Giants dwell there, not as comic brutes, but as ancient powers with old rights. Some are coarse and dangerous. some are handsome and grave. Many are wise. Strongholds like Utgard stand there where a king of giants sits with riddles and illusions that can humble even a thunder god. The boundary with Midgard is not just geography but temperament. It is the line between settled speech and the rough talk of stone and storm. Yet the line is also kinship. Frigg's friend and rival is a giantess. Skadi the huntress, daughter of a giant, marries into the gods and keeps her bow even in a bridal dress. Jotunheim is the necessary adversary. Without it, courage would have no exercise and cleverness would grow dull. Nidavellir, which some name Svartalfheim, lies beneath the skin of the earth. Caverns branch there like the roots of a great tree. Dwarfs keep their forges in that deep country. They are the masters of binding fire to form, and their memory for contracts is longer than a winter night. Old catalogues run through their names as a skald warms his tongue before recitation. From their anvils come rings that drip gold, ships that fold like cloth, boars with bristling light, and a hammer that returns to the hand that throws it. Scholars debate whether the dark elves are the same folk as dwarfs or a neighboring people. The poems leave the answer pleasingly unsettled. What is certain is that this realm stores the knowledge of temper. Nothing there is made in a hurry. Every good thing must be struck and cooled and struck again. Niflheim broods in the far deep where breath smokes and sound carries poorly. From the well called Havagelmir there rise many rivers whose first names are like curses, and they creep outward under rim ice until they fall from the world's edge in a glitter of knives. In that region dwell swarms of snakes led by the ancient eater Nidhogg, who gnaws at the root of the ash and reminds all folk that beginnings decay. Niflheim is not malice by intention. It is endurance and cold accounting. It is the part of the world that refuses to be charmed. Muspelheim is the opposite quarter. There the air moves with heat and sparks fly up like flocks of starlings. Surtur stands at its frontier with a flaming sword that glows through the marrow. The first stars were taken as sparks from this place and set into the high dome. The lesson here is that fire is both tool and judge. It gives light to calendars, and it destroys what has not been built with care. Muspelheim waits. It does not negotiate. It does not forget. Hel, also called Helheim, lies down a hard road beyond the Golden Bridge. Hermod later will ride that way with news in his mouth, and he will return with a condition that cannot quite be met. The realm takes its name from its queen, daughter of Loki, half fair and half corpse pale, who receives those who did not die with sword in hand or under the wing of a shield. Her hall is Eljudnir. Its plate is hunger, its knife is famine. The threshold is a drop that stills the heart. The river Gjöll runs there, and the bridge called Gjallabru arches over it with a glow that is not warm. A maiden named Modgud keeps the crossing and asks sharp questions. At the cave called Gnipperhellir, a hound named Garm bays at the scent of souls. On the shore called Nastron stand houses twisted from the spines of the faithless. Their venom drips from the roof and the ground is not safe to lie upon. Yet most who go to hell are not cowards or villains. They are simply the ordinary dead. They dwell in shadow and remember the taste of air. The realm is somber, not spiteful. These 9 are not arranged in a simple stack. They lace through the ash and touch at edges that change with mood and season. Lines of travel link them. Bifrost runs between Asgard and Midgard, bright as wet silk, strong enough for daily use but not for a full charge by the storm god, who prefers to ford his rivers on foot. Mountain passes thread from Midgard into Jotunheim where the wind cuts like a small knife in the lung. Narrow wells gaped in old time and still open on certain nights, letting a man step from a forest to a hall of antlered masks and antlered manners. Dwarfs, who love contracts, insist on safe conducts stamped with runes before they trade above ground. Elves accept no toll, but demand courtesy that must be exact. The gods themselves keep routines. They ride out from Asgard each morning to sit at the first root and give judgments that hold across worlds. When they travel farther, they wear other names and test hosts for kindness, or at least for brisk honesty. There are also the great rhythms that sweep all realms together. Day rides after night in a wheel that does not miss a spoke. The sun and the moon continue their courses with hunters at their heels who sometimes close but never catch while the age is young. Winds climb from the deep cold and descend again with salt in their hair. The sea rises and folds back, a habit learned long ago when a drinking horn was not only a horn. Snow builds in the north and rain warms in the south. The ash drinks at the roots and breathes with its leaves. The 9 realms do not live side by side as much as they live through one another. That is why the sagas can shift from a farmhouse to a giant hall without apology. The farm and the hall have always been neighbors. Balance in this system is not peace at any price. It is a set of relationships that are renewed each day by action. The gods hold the center by keeping oaths and paying for wisdom. The giants hold the edges by testing what is claimed as final. Men keep their hearths by remembering what is owed to guest and kin and neighbor. The dwarfs build objects that bind these intentions into use. The elves remind everyone that light must fall on what is made or else it will not be worth keeping. Cold demands thrift. Fire demands discipline. Death demands honesty. When each receives its due, the worlds hold. When any is slighted, the tree groans. This is the working map. It explains why a fisherman in Midgard thanks a god of Asgard for a fair wind that rises from Vanaheim, and why he leaves a coin on a stone because a dwarf once mended the clasp on his net. It explains why a poet glances up at night and feels that the sky is not empty, but inhabited, and why an old woman mutters a charm at a doorframe as if the wood could hear. In such a world, nothing is only itself. Every realm lends something to the others, and every debt will one day come due. In the youth of the worlds, when the ash still gleamed with fresh sap and the rainbow road shone with a new wet brightness, discord came to the high field of the gods. It did not arrive as a horn blast or a charge of horse. It came in the quiet tread of a woman whose name the poets split like light through a prism. Some call her Gulveig, which is to say gold drunk, and some call her Hyde, which is to say the one who speaks in bright flames. She walked into the hall of the Aesir with a smile, like a secret, and a craft that the Aesir both desired and feared. That craft was cider, a sorcery of threads and spirits, of seeing what is about to ripen and coaxing it to bear, of bending the wind that moves through human luck. It was not the clean battlefield magic of song and rune. It was a household art and a boundary art, and it answered to will that did not always prefer iron. At first the High Ones marveled. The halls of Asgard glittered, purses filled with a speed that made even careful men giddy. Words could be made to land softly or to bite without a raised voice. The gods thought they were masters of this new power. They were, for a short while, its delighted apprentices. Then they saw what it asked of them. Cider asked that someone sit apart and enter a kind of trance that made the watcher seem unguarded. It asked that the strong risk, a posture the strong despise. It asked that value be found in unusual places, and that desire be named without armor. The Aesir were a people of law and spear and measured song. They judged that the art was beneath them even as they found themselves unable to stop using it. The old poem of the wise woman says that they tried to end the matter in the simplest possible way. They hurled spears. They burned the woman in their own hall. They did it 3 times to be certain. Each time she stood up from the ash and smiled as if nothing at all had been taken from her. Names in these tales are not worn like clothes. They are states of being. If she is Gulveig, then gold speaks. If she is Hyde, then shining speech itself refuses to die. The gods had learned that some forces do not go away because you prefer them tidy. They go away only when balanced by a like and lawful strength. The Vanir had taught her arts and claimed her as kin. They were the old neighbors of the Aesir, keepers of fruitful field and fair wind, negotiators of peace and promise. When they heard that the Aesir had tried to burn their priestess, their anger was cool and thorough. They sent no messenger to argue. They made ready for war. The first spear thrown in anger flashed like a change in weather, and the first war of the gods began. No poet gives us a battle roll with dates and standards. What we have is the signature of the struggle on the world itself. The walls around the high field were shaken and split. Spears lay like reeds after a flood. Songs say the Aesir were strong in the open, and the Vanir were subtle in their counters. The Aesir charged and sang charm songs that harden heart and sharpen edge. The Vanir answered with workings that softened iron and sent confusion into ranks without a single visible blow. It was not a contest between brave and coward. It was a contest between two kinds of keeping. The Aesir kept order by oath and iron. The Vanir kept increase by gift and craft. Neither could bring the other to heel. Seasons passed according to their offices, which is to say that summer came and winter followed. But within those seasons, seed failed in some places, and in others grew in reckless abundance. Currents shifted along the shores. Nets that had never once come up empty rose heavy with fish, and then, in the next moon, brought only froth. The war had touched the household gods of field and sea. Men felt it in their bread and in the weight of their nets. When men asked the Scalds why this must be, they were told a truth that is wiser than comfort. The gods cannot injure one another without the change running through the stems of wheat and the bones of cod. When high things fight, low things pay. The Aesir called parley. The Vanir consented. They met between their realms on a plain with good visibility and little cover, because even the gods prefer not to be ambushed while discussing honor. There they set down their weapons and spoke without shouting. The Aesir admitted that they could not erase Seda, and could not live as if desire and luck were not part of order. The Vanir admitted that field and womb and wind also require a house that can withstand a storm, and a court that can settle envy into fair measure. Each side could tell the other what was wrong with them. Each side could not do without what the other provided. They agreed on peace. Peace among divine houses is not a shrug and a handshake. It is a ritual binding. Both parties stepped to a great vat and spat. They spat on purpose. Spittle is intimate and cannot be faked. It carries the breath of life and the food that made that breath possible. The fluid was gathered and shaped into a being. He rose from the vat, tall and mild-faced, and was called Kvasir. He walked with both households and spoke in ways that settled thought. He was never at a loss for an answer, because he knew how to ask, and because he understood that no single point of view holds a whole world. The figure of Kvasir is not yet a tragedy. It is a lesson. Peace begins when the words of one side can live in the mouth of the other. To seal this covenant, the gods exchanged hostages who were not hostages in chains, but honored guests who promised to live as kin. From Vanaheim came Njord, who understands coastlines and commerce and the patient temper of the sea. With him came his children, Freya and Freya. The sun carries the warmth that wakes seed, and the luck that greets fair bargains. The daughter carries the most complete mastery of Seda ever entrusted to a friend of the Aesir. From Asgard went Hoenir, a chief of noble bearing whose first judgments were clean and quick, and Mimir, keeper of an old head full of counsel. For a time, the exchange worked. In Asgard, the presence of the Vanir brightened the fields and made marriages prosper. Freya laughed and ships came home. Freya taught without shame a craft the Aesir had once refused, and she built a hall called Sessrumnir that can grow to fit all who seek true comfort. In Vanaheim, the sword songs of the Aesir were admired, and the habit of swift decision pleased those who had sometimes spent too long weighing the fine shades of agreement. Hoenir presided with a calm that looked like wisdom. Whenever he had Mimir at his elbow, he spoke like a man who had slept well and read widely. This would be a smooth tale if it ended there. It does not. The Vanir noticed that when Mimir was away on an errand, Hoenir's counsels slowed to a stop. The chieftain would look at the ceiling, or at a knot in a tabletop, and say that the matter should be decided by others. The Vanir are not simple, but they are not infinitely patient either. They believed that they had been insulted with a figurehead. They believed they had been given a fine horse that would not pull unless its groom stood close enough to smell the bit. They did something terrible and instructive. They cut off the head of Mimir and sent it back to Asgard in a sack. The Aesir received that sack with a grief that burned without smoke. Odin took the head and spoke to it, and would not let it slide into silence. He anointed it with herbs and sung over it, and taught it the art of staying. The head did not rot. It spoke into Odin's ear, as it had once spoken into Hoenir's. From then on, the Council of Asgard had a counselor who did not need a chair. If this seems gruesome, remember that these myths insist that wisdom is dear, and that things worth keeping are often kept by care that looks stern to the soft-hearted. The death of Mimir ended the experiment of Hoenir's rule in Vanaheim. The Vanir did not call for new blood. They renounced their anger and accepted the cost as paid. The exchange remained balanced by Njord and his children living among the Aesir, and by a shared understanding that had not existed before. Kvasir continued to wander and answer every riddle, a living treaty with a voice. In years to come, 2 dwarfs would kill him and brew from his blood a mead that confers poetry and learns speech, and Odin would steal that mead for gods and men. That later theft belongs to another part of our story. For the moment, we should keep our attention on the fact that peace was made, that its seal walked the roads in sandals, and that the 2 houses of the gods became in truth one pantheon. The lessons of this war do not flatter any side. The Aesir misjudged a power because it made them uncomfortable. The Vanir punished deceit with a deed that could not be untaken. The settlement required each to accept what the other did best. As a result, ships found better winds and courts found surer words. The Aesir learned to honor a magic that works by attention and patience. The Vanir accepted the need for a wall that can hold when cold bites and hunger thinks of other people's grain. The world prospered because the High Ones admitted that strength without growth starves, and growth without strength spoils. There is a final scene the poets like to place after the formalities, simple as a good meal at the end of a long day. The gods together sit on Idavol under the ash, and there is talk that does not look like debate. Odin's one eye is steady. Freya's necklace Brisingamen catches a small piece of Sunday Njord, describes a sandbar that moves with every storm. Frigg asks a question and receives an answer that is both tender and practical. Thor snores discreetly in a corner after too much roast and too many cups, while Tyr watches the door and smiles from time to time. Someone asks a riddle. Kvasir laughs before he speaks. It is the sound that remains after a war that no one won. The war did not end with a single trumpet or a last heroic charge. It ended with a recognition, as clean as a north wind, that neither house could do without the other. The Aesir brought iron law, oath, and the proud craft of song that steadies courage. The Vanir brought increase, fair weather, and the deep patience that makes fields and people prosper. They walked onto a bare plain between their realms, set their weapons aside, and agreed to bind peace in a manner that could not be faked. They spat into a great vessel. The act was intimate and solemn because it carried breath and food and the truth of a mouth that cannot lie to itself. From that mingled spittle they shaped a man. He stood up calm and bright-eyed and was named Kvasir. He embodied the truce. Wherever he went, he settled quarrels without drawing a blade. He never lacked an answer, not because he was glib, but because he understood the grain of things and spoke with it instead of against it. He belonged to both houses at once and to neither alone, which is the right condition for a keeper of peace. Peace also requires pledge. Each side gave hostages who were not prisoners but honored guests pledged to live as kin. From Vanaheim came Njord and his children, Freya and Freyja. Njord knows harbors and trade, and the sane courage that steers a ship through a white-edged channel. He keeps his hall at Noaton, where oar strokes and gull cries mix with the smell of tar and wet rope. Freyja carries the luck of good years, and the rain that answers the plough. He is mild and strong, and he smiles like weather at its most generous. Freyja brings the mastery of cider and the unapologetic knowledge that desire is a force to be trained, not denied. She raises a hall named Sesrumnir in a field called Folkvang, where she receives a share of the noble dead and gives comfort without flattery. In all this, the Vanir did not yield their nature. They brought it intact as a gift the Aesir needed. To Asgard went Hoenir and Mimir. Hoenir was tall and comely, and in the first days spoke decisions that pleased every ear. Mimir was older and less adorned. He carried a mind full of counsel and an air that warned fools to keep their voices down. For a time the arrangement worked like a well-set weir. In Asgard, the sea breathed more kindly, the barns filled, oaths took firmer hold. In Vanaheim, judgments came more quickly, and feasts ended with a final word that did not unravel by morning. Then the weakness in the weave showed. The Vanir discovered that without Mimir at his side, Hoenir could not settle even a simple dispute. He would say that others should decide. He would admire the ceiling or the pattern in a board and pass the matter along. The Vanir are patient, not credulous. They believed they had been insulted with a figurehead lent authority by a hidden tutor. Their anger was cold and exact. They took Mimir and cut off his head and sent it to Asgard with no further speeches. Grief in Asgard did not gnash and burn. It worked. Odin took the head in his hands. He anointed it with herbs against rot. He spoke charms that keep speech from fading. He set it in a place of honor and asked it questions as a king asks his steadiest friend. Mimir answered as he had always answered, with counsel measured against consequence. The halls of Asgard kept their advisor, and the price of peace was written in a way no one would forget. Wisdom is dear, and once lost it must be kept by vigilance rather than pride. Kvasir, meanwhile, walked the roads of gods and men. He visited halls where the fire was not bright and the benches were plain. He taught a farmer how to divide a field so that each son would bless the other. He stood in dwarf forges and asked about the temper of iron and why some metal rings true while another sulks and splits. He taught the difference between a riddle and a trap. He set riddles that make men better at their work. He did not shame the slow-witted. He waited while they found the thread, and he praised the knot when it held. In the Skaldic tradition, the greatest praise is to say that a man speaks with Kvasir's mouth. In the oldest tales, his end is dark and will matter later, for two dwarfs will kill him and brew from his blood a mead that grants poetry and learning. For now he lives, and the treaty walks with him. The covenant also changed custom in Asgard. Seda, once scorned, was taught by Freyja in a manner that kept its power without dishonoring those who learned it. The Aesir discovered that to govern well, they must know not only what men owe to law, but also what luck owes to attention. Sharp runes and frank spells held the center together. Oaths were made on rings that mattered, and were kept because both houses watched them. Councils at Idavol grew quieter and more exact. The boast at table gave way more often to a promise that could be audited at harvest. Freyr became a favorite guest at every threshold. With him, winters bit fairly, and summers did not turn lazy. He walked Midgard as easily as he moved among the gods, and was greeted in ploughed furrows as a neighbor who knows which cloud will break and which will pass. Njord sat with fishermen and shipwrights, and showed them how to read the color of water where the sandbar moves after a storm. Freya moved through halls, and taught women and men alike that craft requires courage, and that love has work to do. The Vanir did not come to conquer. They came to complete, and the difference shows in the way bread rose and arguments ended. The Aesir brought their own gifts to the shared table. Tyr set rules for settlement that kept honor without breeding feuds. Frigg taught that foresight is not fear, and that a mother can keep a house from vanity as easily as from hunger. Thor learned to sit in judgment without breaking the bench, and sometimes even without speaking. Even Loki, before his turn toward the worst of his nature, watched and learned how a clever word can mend a ripped friendship as well as it can cause one. Peace is not a spell that lasts without maintenance. It is a set of habits that are watered daily. In the years that followed, the gods remembered the day on the bare plain and kept that memory near when the old habits of suspicion stirred. The sight of Mimir's preserved head in the high hall made princes and poets lower their voices. The gentle authority of Kvasir prevented more fights than any spear. When envoys came from distant halls, they saw two houses seated together without stiffness. The truce had become kinship. The pantheon truly was one. Thus, the covenant of peace did what wars never do. It gave the world more life than it took. It bound iron to reign and law to increase. It made a place where both blade and blossom could be honored without apology. In that balanced order, the story can now move to the work of building and keeping, for after peace comes the work of walls and the testing of wit. After peace came prudence. The gods had learned that strength without vigilance is a promise easily broken. Giants still gathered beyond the boundary forest. The sea still remembered the flood that bled from Ymir. The high field needed a rampart that would slow the next calamity and give the watchman time to sound his horn. So the Aesir sat in council on Idavol and spoke of stone and plan. A stranger arrived while they debated. He was broad-shouldered and close-mouthed, the kind of worker who lets his hands introduce him. He offered to raise a wall around all Asgard, a fortification so stout that no giant would scale it, and to finish the entire work within a single winter. His price struck the hall like a cold wind. He asked for the goddess Freya as his bride, and also for the sun and the moon. There was a long silence, for that demand would strip the world of warmth and joy and turn the sky to brass. They would have refused at once if cunning had not spoken from the end of the bench. Loki argued that an impossible bargain is no bargain at all. Let the stranger try, he said, but bind him with terms that no mason could meet. The gods agreed to this counsel, which was daring and a little careless, and set conditions as sharp as a sword. The builder must complete the wall by the first day of summer. He must work alone. He must take no help from any man. If he failed even by a single stone, he would receive nothing. If he succeeded, the payment would be exactly as asked. The mason accepted. Then he asked leave to use his stallion to haul the great blocks. He named the animal Svadilfari. The gods looked at one another and decided that a horse was not a man. They granted the request, and by that small loophole opened a larger story. The work began at once. Through short days and long nights, the builder cut and set stone. When dusk came down, Svadilfari strained in the harness and dragged boulders that 10 oxen could not have budged. The pace was astonishing. The wall rose clean and plumb, courses fitted with a care that would shame a royal tomb. Each morning the gods walked the line and found whole stretches completed while they slept. Winter thinned, and the sun began to remember its strength. There were now only a few courses left to set. The hall grew uneasy. It is one thing to outwit a boastful stranger in theory. It is another to watch him succeed. They summoned another council and stared at Loki until his silence grew heavy. He had urged the bargain. He must prevent the loss. If the builder collected Freya and the bright orbs of heaven, Asgard would be a place of cold speeches and no harvest. Loki lifted his hands in a theatrical shrug and said that he would attend to the matter. It is easier to promise a deed than to endure its consequences. Night fell. The builder yoked Svadilfari and went to the quarry. Snow lay blue under the stars. From the trees, there came a sound that made the stallion's ears turn. A young mare stepped from the birches and tossed her head. She was small and quick and beautiful, and she smelled like spring grass after a storm. She trotted a little way and looked back. Svadilfari forgot the trace chains and the stone that waited in the sled. He whinnied, tore himself free, and followed her into the shadows. The builder cursed and ran after them, but he could not match a lover's legs. The 2 horses vanished among the trunks, and the mason found himself alone under a pale moon with a useless sledge. All night the stallion did not return. All morning the builder searched and swore. At noon he tried to set stones without his helper, and discovered that his strength, though formidable, was not enough to move what he had planned to move. Evening came empty. The next night, the same scene played, for the little mare had a mind of her own, and Svadilfari's mind was entirely hers. The deadline drew near. The final courses remained unfinished. When the gods saw that the contract would fail by a narrow margin, they set their jaws and waited. On the last day of winter, the stranger raged at the wall and at the terms and at the company that had laughed behind their sleeves. In his fury he threw off caution and showed his nature. He was a giant of the frost folk, a Rimthurs who had cloaked himself in an honest worker's patience. The moment his true shape stood revealed, the Aesir called for the protector they trust when talk is spent. Thor strode out, lifted the hammer that never misses, and the giant's skull rang once and broke like thin ice. The body fell among the stones he had set so precisely. The echo died beyond the wall he had nearly finished. The gods did not boast. They had skirted danger and been rescued by a trick they would not care to describe too fully. The wall stood, tall and close-fitted, with only a small loss at the crown that the next season would supply from tamer labor. Asgard had its rampart. Freya kept her freedom. The sun and the moon carried on with their measured courses. That was not the end of the tale. Some months later, a grey foal followed Loki back to the high field. The foal had 8 legs and a look of calm that comes from knowing no rival can catch you. For it was Loki who had been the mayor in the birch grove. He had taken that shape to lure Svadilfari away, and had done so quite completely. The offspring of that encounter was Sleipnir, finest of all horses, light of hoof on air and sure of foot on sea. Odin accepted the strange gift without comment, and rode Sleipnir thereafter to places other mounts cannot reach. In time, that horse would carry a messenger to Hel and bring him back again. In time, he would bear his rider over the heads of men and the backs of waves. A scandal had become a treasure. The story keeps a double ledger. On one page, the gods were saved by trickery. On the other, they paid a cost that cannot be counted in coin. Loki had crossed a boundary and returned with a gift that both enriched and unsettled the company. The wall was won, but by means that left a taste. The lesson does not flatter Asgard. Contracts must be drafted with care. Counsel taken in haste will demand repayment. Strength is necessary when guile has gone too far. Yet the tale does not argue for a world made only of careful minutes and clean edges. It argues for watchfulness, for honest work by day, and for an understanding that the night will sometimes require an art that does not sit comfortably at the oaken table. When the watchman later looked out from Himinbjorg, he saw the new wall catch the morning and throw it back across the roofs. When the wolfish wind came down from the glaciers, it met stone that did not flinch. When messengers arrived at the gate, they passed through a doorway made by a giant's hand and a god's demand. This is how the High Ones keep their home. They accept that order is built out of unlikely partnerships. Even a foe can be harnessed to the work of safety, though it is best to keep a thunderer within call. The new wall had hardly settled upon its foundations when mischief struck within the gates. Loki, restless as a spark in dry straw, crept behind Sif as she slept and sheared away her famous hair. In the morning the hall saw Sif shorn and ashamed. Thor rose from the bench like weather turning. He seized Loki and promised to quiet the trickster forever unless the golden hair returned to Sif's head as if it had never been touched. Loki pleaded for time and escaped down into the halls of the dwarfs where the anvils never cool. He went first to the sons of Ivaldi, master smiths who work in caverns that smell of coal and clean metal. He bargained and flattered and swore that their names would be sung in Asgard if they would create a marvel. They drew out gold as a baker draws dough and spun it into strands finer than wheat at harvest. The gift they placed in Loki's hands looked like a soft fall of sunlight. When set upon Sif's scalp, it would take root and grow, and it would never dim. The same workshop then shaped two further wonders. For Odin they forged a spear called Gungnir that would bite cleanly and never miss the mark. For Freyr they built a ship named Skidbladnir, broad of deck and true on any sea, yet so cleverly made that it could be folded like cloth and carried in a pouch. Loki, seeing a chance to rise from fear to praise, decided that 3 gifts were not enough. He crossed to another forge where 2 brothers worked with fewer words and a steadier rhythm. They were Sindri and his brother Brokkr, though some call the maker by the name Eitri. Loki spoke as a merchant speaks when the stall is closing. He boasted that the sons of Ivaldi had made treasures beyond compare. He laid a wager of his own head that these brothers could not do better. Pride and craft smiled at each other, and the brothers agreed. Sindri laid a lump of pig iron on the anvil and told Brokkr to keep the bellows going without falter, no matter what happened. Loki changed his shape into a biting fly and set about ruining the work with a persistence that would have impressed a saint if saints had reason to admire flies. As the iron glowed, Loki fastened on Brokkr's hand and drove in his sting. The dwarf kept the bellows breathing, as if he were the wind itself. Sindri lifted the lid of the forge and drew out a boar. Its bristles were gold. They shed light enough to run through night forests as if it were noon. This was Gullinbursti, the golden-bristled one, a mount for Freyr swifter than any horse and tireless in deep snow or over the sea before the wind. Sindri set the boar aside and laid a block of gold in the coals. He warned Brokkr again. Loki flew at the back of the dwarf's neck and stung until blood ran. The bellows did not rest. From the mold came a ring, heavy and flawless, named Draupnir. Every 9th night, 8 new rings of equal weight would drop from it, a measured abundance that reminded the gods that true wealth is what returns on a fixed day. For the last trial, Sindri placed iron in the forge and told Brokkr that now failure would be costly. Loki fastened on the eyelid and bit until the blood blinded the bellows man. Brokkr brushed his eye, and for a moment the breath of fire slowed. Sindri lifted the work, and there lay a hammer. The head was perfect, and the temper would never crack, but the handle had come out a little short. Even so, the tool had a name that silence accepts. This was Mjolnir, the crusher, the lightning in a hand, the weapon the world needed, even if the world did not know it yet. The dwarf brothers carried their gifts to Asgard and demanded a fair hearing. The gods gathered on Idavol with the light falling slant through the high hall. Loki presented the hair that would grow upon Sif. He showed the spear that would never fail, and the ship that would carry a whole army and then fold to a parcel. Brokkr stepped forward with the boar to light the dark, the ring that renews itself, and the hammer that returns to its owner when thrown. The assembly judged with the care of men who have seen fraud and know how to smell it. They ruled that the brothers had won. Mjolnir weighed most heavily on the scales because it would stand between Asgard and ruin when giants came over the ice. Brokkr then asked for payment according to the wager. Loki's head had been pledged. Loki smiled with the air of a scribe who has found a clause. He conceded that his head could be forfeit, but his neck had not been part of the bargain. To cut off the one without harming the other was impossible. The gods are not a court for tricks, yet they enjoy a tidy point when it serves justice. Brokkr accepted that he could not claim the neck, but said nothing about the mouth. He took a thong and a bodkin and sewed Loki's lips shut, so that for a time the hall rested from quick remarks that cut deeper than they seemed. When the stitches were loosed later, the scar remained as a reminder that speech is a tool and a hazard. The gifts were distributed with ceremony. Sif's golden hair was placed upon her head and took hold like ivy. It grew at once and shone, and with it her honor stood whole again. Odin received Gungnir and marked treaties with its point so that oaths would hold. He took Draupnir as well and set it upon the altar, for the ring measures time and brings steady bounty. Freyr claimed Skidbladnir for the season when the gods would sail north, and for every journey where a harbor is small and the wind uncertain. He took Gullinbursti as a proud companion for dark rides when the mountain paths are thin as a knife. Thor lifted Mjolnir and felt that his hand was at last complete. The hammer would crack the skull of any giant. It would return when thrown. It would bless a cradle and a marriage bed with the same sure grace it carried in war. He laid it on his knees, and the hall breathed easier. Old verses love to count the uses of these wonders. When Thor hurls the hammer, mountains remember the blow. When Odin casts Gungnir in the air before battle, he dedicates the field to himself, and fate tightens. When Freya raises the bristled boar, harvests remember how to fill grain jars. When Skidbladnir is spread, it holds a troop of gods, and when it is folded, it fits beneath a cloak. When the 9th night comes, Draupnir drops its golden brood, and the chest in the temple is full in a way that is both literal and sacred. When Sif walks, the light plays on her hair, and men recall that beauty restored is not vanity, but a sign that a house is sound after a storm. It is tempting to say that Loki learned a lesson. He learned a technique. He would play the forges again in other tales, and not always for good. Yet even here, where spite began the business, the end was a strengthening of the realm. Asgard now had tools worthy of its charge. The gods saw that craft is the equal of courage, that law without gifts is cold, and that gifts without law beg to be stolen. The dwarfs returned to their caves with the satisfaction of makers who have matched a boast with a proof. The trickster nursed his mouth and thought about vengeance in a way that would later cost the world. In the evenings that followed, when the council was done and the meat was carved, Thor would sometimes set Mjolnir on the table and draw a finger over its edge as if to greet an old friend. Odin would weigh Draupnir in his palm and feel time like a heartbeat. Freyr would call for Skidbladnir to be opened in the yard, just to watch the ribs spread and the sail catch a friendly breath. Sif would unbraid her hair, and it would fall like a river over her shoulders. In such moments, the gods looked less like legends and more like people who know what it means to keep a home within a dangerous world. Among the many names of the High God, there is one that rises whenever the subject is knowledge won at cost. He is called the All-Father not only because he leads the company of gods, but because he feeds his mind on every source of counsel he can reach. Valor is common coin in Asgard. Clear sight is rarer. Odin desired that sight so completely that he sought the oldest spring beneath the world tree, the well kept by Mimir, whose advice endures like iron in cold water. The road to that place is not easy. It lies under a route that runs outward toward the countries of giants, where stone holds its breath and wind is lean. There Mimir sits as if grown from the same rock, a guardian who does not flatter the thirsty. The water he keeps is not a fountain for travelers, but a store of memory gathered since the first thaw. It does not give answers to those who want shortcuts. It gives a pattern only to those who will carry the weight of it. Odin came to the well and asked for a drink. He did not plead. He stated his need as a king states a claim. Mimir answered as keepers answer when they know the price of their charge. He named a pledge that would mark the bargain forever. The god must leave one eye in the depths. Odin accepted at once. He plucked out his own eye and placed it in the spring. The water took it. In that moment he gained a vision that does not belong to a face. From then on his single gaze looked outward, while the eye below looked into the past and the dark. He paid and he drank. What he learned in that draught was not a mere list of facts. He tasted the way fate grows like a lichen on stone. He saw that counsel matters only when taken before a spear is raised, and that even wise kings must pay for their understanding with something that will not grow back. This first sacrifice made him sharper, not softer. He knew that the hidden grammar of the world was written in signs older than speech, and he set himself to win them. He turned away from feasting and comfort, and undertook an ordeal that no other among the gods even considered. At the heart of the ash, he chose a bough that leans over dark, and there he wounded himself with his own spear and gave himself to himself. He hung for 9 nights and 9 days. He ate nothing and drank nothing. He stared downward where the wind scrapes bark and the root breathes cold from the deep. Old verses preserve his voice without ornament. He says he hung on the tree that no one knows the root of. He says he was pierced and given to the god that he is, which is to say that he paid himself into his own keeping. He says he peered until he saw the shapes of power turn and flash under him like fish just below the surface. These were the runes. They are not decorations, and they are not a mere alphabet. Each is a little treaty between will and world, a stroke that can persuade wood and water and iron to listen for a time. When he recognized them, he reached and seized them. He fell from the branch and stood on the ground again, changed in a way that made even his friends wary. Afterward, he taught the names and uses of the signs to those who could carry them without folly. He kept the hardest work for himself. He learned charms for binding and loosening, for closing a wound and for cooling a fevered head. He learned how to blunt a blade without touching the metal. He learned how to tie a knot in a gust so that a sailor can buy a breath of wind when the sea forgets to move. He learned how to take the heat out of a blaze on a friend's shield, and how to free a hostage without breaking a single link of the chain. The poems count more than a dozen of these workings, and hint at others that are not put into words, because the wise do not boast overmuch about such things. To make his new sight serve more than a single moment, Odin ordered his days around counsel. He sent his ravens at dawn. One is called Thought, and the other is called Memory. They fly all over the world and return at evening to settle on his shoulders and speak softly into his ear. Their reports are not gossip. They bring the grain of each day, what men dared, what kings promised, what strangers attempted on dark roads and bright seas. In the high hall, 2 grey wolves lie at his feet, and he breaks bread with them more often than he eats himself. He sits while the company feasts and listens, and lets his mind travel along the lines that his eye in the well and his eye and his head together lay before him. Because he had drunk at Mimir's spring, he continued to visit counsel in many forms. He spoke to women who see what is coming when others see only the steam on a kettle. He paid for truth, given by those who live at the edges and do not need the praise of courts. He kept the preserved head of Mimir with herbs and spells, and consulted it still, not as a puppet, but as an elder. He did this without shame. In these tales, a ruler is not smaller for taking advice. He is larger for knowing which advice is dear and which is cheap. These gains did not make Odin gentle. They made him serious. When he sets a spear over a battlefield, he does it as a man who knows what the aftermath will cost in mothers and in fodder and in time, and who still believes that some strife cannot be put off without worse harm. When he bargains with giants, he does not reach for his hammer first, not because he fears them, but because the price of a broken truce is always paid by someone who never sat in a council. When he chooses men for his hall, he chooses not only the bold, but also those who kept their oaths when it was inconvenient. And the poets are clear that this second quality pleases him as much as the first. His worship among men reflects this character. Those who tied a noose to a branch to dedicate an offering to him knew him as the god who understands the edge between life and learning. Those who cut runes on the haft of an axe or on the lintel of a barn door did so in the belief that order is not merely declared, but carved. Those who asked for a whispered hint before they risked a voyage or a judgment brought him a portion of what they had and asked him to pay attention, which he did if the request was worthy. There is sternness in this portrait, but no gloom. The law says plainly that wisdom can be had and that it is worth its price. The sight he won at the well made him the kind of king who does not blink when a friend must be told hard truth. The strength he won on the branch made him a maker of songs that do not flatter and of spells that hold when a storm tries the rafters. If other gods love contest or comfort or the shine of gold, Odin loves the moment just before a choice when the air is clear and a man can see what line he must take. In the seasons that followed these sacrifices, the worlds altered their posture very slightly. Judgments given under the ash grew sharper. Oaths taken on the ring were asked with more care because the oath-takers felt that the ring was listening. The watchman's horn sounded no more often than before, but when it did, the company moved with an efficiency that belongs to those who have rehearsed without boasting about rehearsal. It is not magic alone that keeps the center. It is the attention to the way things are joined. From the first sip at Mimir's spring to the night he let wind and darkness teach him the runes, Odin made himself the kind of ruler who understands that power without knowledge is a gloved hand that cannot feel the work. He did not gather these things to decorate his legend. He gathered them because a world fenced with a giant's eyebrows and defended by a hammer still needs a mind that sees before others see and pays before others pay. Peace had given the gods time to listen, and from their listening had come Kvasir, the living pledge of truce, who walked the worlds with answers that fit like a key in a well-made lock. He did not argue. He clarified. He traveled to halls with smoke-black rafters and to caverns where iron sweated on stone. No riddle defeated him. Because wisdom draws both love and envy, 2 dwarfs named Fjalar and Galar invited him to their bench and murdered him. They drained his blood into a kettle and 2 vats, mixed it with honey, and brewed a mead so potent that a single draught bestowed poetry, scholarship, and quick understanding. They named the vessels Aurora, Bodn, and Sun. From that hour, poets could say that verse is Kvasir's blood, and learned speech could be called the draught of Aurora. Fjalar and Galar did not keep their crime quiet. They boasted, then compounded it. They lured a giant named Gilling to the sea and drowned him. When his wife wailed, they dropped a millstone on her at the threshold and ended her grief. Their son Suttung came raging for justice. He set them on a skerry and waited for the tide to pull them away like chips of bark. The dwarfs bought their lives by giving him the mead. Suttung carried it inland to a mountain called Hunitbjorg and hid it in a chamber cut from rock. He set his daughter Gunnlod to guard it in solitude with a stout heart and a steady cup. Odin heard of these events as a king hears of a threat to his people. He knew that the mead held more than a sweet drink. It held the ordered fire that teaches the tongue to name truly. He resolved to win it for the gods and for those mortals who could shape words well. He set out in a plain hat and a blue cloak and took a working name. Men called him Bolverk, which is to say doer of difficult deeds. On a summer day he came to a hayfield where 9 men stood with scythes that pulled green waves from the meadow. Bolverk praised their cutting and drew from his belt a whetstone. With a few sure strokes he made the blade sing. Each man begged to buy the stone. He tossed it high, and they fought for it, and killed each other in the grass. Odin walked on, and came to the farm of Baugi, the brother of Suttung. Baugi stood with an empty face. His 9 servants lay dead in the field, and the season was moving. Bolverk offered to do the labor of all 9, if Baugi would ask Suttung for a single drink of the mead as payment. The bargain was struck. Bolverk cut hay and stacked sheaves and did not tire. When the work was finished, Baugi went to his brother and asked for the agreed sip. Suttung refused. He would not part with a drop. Wisdom had cost him blood, and he trusted no one with it. Bolverk did not withdraw. He handed Baugi an auger called Rati, and they climbed to Hnitbjorg. Bolverk set the point to the rock and told Baugi to bore. When Baugi said the hole was through, Bolverk blew into it, and the dust blew back into his face. He told Baugi to bore again. The second time, the dust flew inward. The rock was open. Bolverk changed himself into a snake and slipped through the narrow cut. Baugi struck at him with the auger, but the serpent had already passed beyond the reach of a jealous brother's arm. In the chamber beyond sat Gunnlod on a stone bench before the 3 vessels. She had kept a long watch. She had been taught to distrust. Odin did not steal past her like a thief. He became a young man who spoke with quiet gravity. He asked for a place to sit and for a word. She gave both. He asked for a bed for a single night. She asked for a promise that honored her solitude. He stayed 3 nights and sang to her of dawn on snow and of the kindness that a steady hand shows to a full cup, and he listened when she spoke of a mountain that does not sleep and of duty that does not ask for praise. When the 3rd night ended, she opened the stoppers and granted him 3 drinks, 1 from each vessel. Odin placed his mouth to Odra and drew not a sip but a vat. He drank bodden empty. He emptied Sun. He had promised 3 drinks, and he had taken 3, yet all the mead was gone into him. He changed shape again and became a great eagle with a shadow that crossed the stones like storm cloud. He beat the chambers with wind and rose into the light. Suttung heard the thunder of those wings and took eagle form to give chase. The 2 shapes rushed above fjord and fell field, over men who raised their hands to shade their eyes and wondered why day darkened at noon. In Asgard, the gods saw their king coming with his belly full of a treasure that must not be spilled into the sea. They set vats near the wall and called to him, as men call to a ship running before a gale. At the last moment, Odin crossed the rampart, flared his wings, and spat the mead into the ready tubs. Suttung, baffled and beaten, dropped from the sky and turned back to his own high crag. Not all of the mead made the wall. A few drops fell along the way. Those scant drippings are said to belong to rhymers who mistake speed for art, and to scholars who carry many facts and little sense. The good portion stayed with the gods to be given as they please. From that day, skalds say that poetry is the drink of dwarfs and the ransom of Suttung and the cargo of the eagle. They call it the wave that breaks on the lip of the wise and the ale that flows from a drawer. They thread kennings like beads on a string to honor the story of its theft and to prove that they are of the company that remembers. Odin did not hoard the prize behind a locked door. He poured from it sparingly and in season. He gave a mouthful to a youth who could listen longer than his peers. He blessed a woman who recited laws so clearly that quarrels ended at her word. He tilted the vat toward a farm boy whose verses kept men at the oar through sleet. He let a few drops splash on a craftsman who then cut runes on a beam with such grace that a hall felt sound when the storm struck. When a skald asked and was turned away, it was not stinginess. It was craft. To waste a vintage is a sin against the vine. The story has edges that teach. The dwarfs show that craft without conscience will trade lives for applause. The giant shows that grief can become avarice and turn to stone in the chest. Gunlod shows that duty can soften without dissolving, and that keeping watch does not forbid love. Baugi shows that a man can be used when he will not learn to say no. Odin shows that cunning in the service of order becomes a kind of harvest. He steals, but he steals a stolen thing and gives it a fate beyond a locked cave. Because of this theft, the North remembered words as work. The mead did not turn fools into sages. It raised the work of the willing. It made verse that could carry a ship through a black water crossing and law that could hold a family through a bad winter. It made historians whose lists do not taste of dust. It made riddlers who do not waste your evening. In the halls where a skald pours out a praise poem, you can hear the echo of an eagle and the whisper of a woman in a stone room who opened her hand to a guest and trusted that what is given in good faith can bless more than one house. When night falls in Asgard and the benches are quiet, a cup sometimes passes that is darker than wine and brighter than water. Odin lifts it and looks into it as a farmer looks into a bucket at a well and judges the day by the reflection. He drinks, and the hall warms by a degree no hearth can supply. The next morning, a new verse comes to a young mouth in Midgard. A sailor, speaking in a low voice, finds the right words to honor a dead friend. A child repeats a proverb that rings like iron and saves an older man from a poor decision. The mead has traveled again by ways that no road shows. Thus, the mead of poetry came into the keeping of the gods. It keeps company with the runes and with the eye that sleeps in deep water. Together they make a triad of Odin's will. He paid, he suffered, he stole. In each act, the end was the same. He made a world of law and risk and song, a little more able to bear its weight. The protector of Midgard does not often sit long at a bench. Thor is at home in the noise of wheels and the smell of storm. When he travels, he rides a chariot drawn by two goats whose names crackle like dry wood in a hearth. They are Tanjost and Tangrisnir. When night overtakes him in the wild, he slaughters them for supper and lays their cleaned bones on the skins. At dawn, he lifts the hammer over the remains and the goats stand up whole again, shaking their ears as if they had only napped. The rule is strict. Do not break the marrow bones. A poor farmer once learned this too late. Loki had urged the farmer's son to crack a leg for the sweet core. In the morning, one goat rose with a limp. Thor saw the splinter and scowled. He forgave the family but took the children as recompense. They were Thjalfi and Roskva, a sharp-eyed boy and his steady sister, who from that day ran at the Thunderer's side. With Loki as companion and Thjalfi hard at his heel, Thor set out eastward to the land of giants. He does not like to use the Rainbow Road. He wades the rivers instead, a habit both practical and proud. The world beyond the high wall is not empty. The trees stand far apart in the giant forests, and the sky seems taller. One night, they found a great hall with a low door and no smoke hole. They slept there, grateful for shelter, though the hall had a strange smell, and the floor sloped as if it had been built in a hurry. Near dawn, the building heaved. The ground trembled. The walls groaned like old ships. Thor rose and stood in the doorway with his hammer. Outside lay a shape that filled the valley. A man so large that a glove dropped from his belt would look like a house to smaller folk. The hall where Thor had taken rest was the thumb of that glove, and the smell that had troubled him was the sweat of a giant who had thrown it aside. The giant's name was Skrymir. The meeting was not friendly and not quite hostile. Skrymir spoke like a man who has no need to shout. He tied his food into a bag and asked Thor to share his path. The company walked all day beneath trees that shot up as if they had been sown by titans. When evening fell, Skrymir tossed to Thor the food bag and told him to eat. The knot was bound with a trick of sinew that refused every tug. Thor pulled until his hands burned. He bit the thong. He worked the knot with every art he knew. The bag did not yield. Hunger makes even the patient short-tempered. Thor stepped back, gripped the hammer, and brought it down on Skrymir's head with a blow that should have split a boulder. The giant opened one eye and asked if a leaf had fallen. He rolled over and slept again. Near midnight, Thor tried once more. He took the hammer in both hands and struck with a force that rings in poems. The giant stirred and wondered aloud whether a bird had dropped a twig. He snored. Toward dawn, Thor summoned every part of his strength and swung so that the hammer blurred in the air. The giant woke and rubbed his forehead and asked if a nut had fallen from a branch. Then he rose, pointed the travelers toward a stone fortress he called Utgard, and went on his way. Thor found 3 deep dents in a nearby hill where the blows had landed. He understood that some trick had turned his strength aside, and that offense taken now would be wasted. He kept his anger, but folded it small and went forward. The fortress of Utgard rose from the flat land like a cliff that had taken up a soldier's duty. Its wall was so tall that Thor could not see the top when he stood with his shoulder against the stone. The gate was shut, and no latch showed on the outside. The 3 companions searched for a seam and found none. Thialfi at last slipped through the bars with the ease of a hare, and the others followed. Inside the hall sat a company of giants, and at their head a king with a face like a winter sky. He named himself Utgard Loki. He welcomed the guests with a courtesy that had iron in it, and said that no one would be allowed to stay unless he could win honor in a contest. It is a hard thing to refuse a challenge when one wears a hammer on his belt. Loki offered first. He said he could eat faster than any man in the hall. A trough was set upon the floor, heaped from end to end with roasted meat. A rival took the far side, a lean fellow with a calm expression whose name was Logi. At the signal they began. Loki worked like a man who had spent his youth at feast and famine both. He reached the middle with a last mouthful already between his teeth. He lifted his hands to show them empty. Logi had eaten to the same point and beyond. He had taken in meat and bones, and even the wooden trencher beneath. The king nodded. He said that the stranger had eaten well, but not as well as fire eats, and he named Logi for what he truly was, a living blaze in the shape of a man. Thialfi spoke next. He said he could run faster than anyone in the hall. The king called his runner, a lank youth called Hugi. They took the course on the level ground outside the fortress. The first race was over, almost before it began. Hugi crossed the line while Thialfi was still far from it. The boy asked for another try, and the second heat was closer only in kindness. The third humbled him. The king praised Thialfi's courage and then told the truth. Hugi is thought. No foot outpaces it. Now the hall looked to Thor. The king eyed the drinking horn on the wall and smiled. He said that any grown man who wished to be reckoned strong should drain that horn in a single pull, or at the least in two, and certainly in three. The vessel was large, but not beyond hope. Thor lifted it and drank long. When he set it down, the level had dropped scarcely a finger's breadth. A murmur ran through the benches. The king said that the attempt had been gallant. Thor set his teeth and drank again. The fall was little more than the first. A third time he lifted and drank until his chest burned. When he peered into the horn, the ale still stood high. He wiped his mouth and said nothing. Utgard Loki remarked that he had seen many men do better and few do worse. The insult walked the edge of courtesy. Thor kept his hand from the hammer by a thin mastery. The king proposed a different trial. He had a cat, he said, that played at his feet and amused the company. If Thor wished to show strength, let him lift the cat from the floor. The animal was grey and long-backed, with eyes that held a pale cunning. Thor stooped and set his hands under the belly. The cat arched and arched until its back rose like the roof of a hall, and its paws seemed to touch every corner of the world. Thor strained until his knees shook, and at last raised a single paw from the boards. The hall laughed. The king said that he had expected more from the fame of the Thunderer. Thialfi bit his lip. Loki stared at the rafters to keep from speaking. The last test was wrestling. The king said that he had no men quite Thor's size, but that an old woman in his house would match him for a fall. Her name was Ellie. She entered veiled and moved with the stiff grace of someone who counts her steps. Thor gripped her lightly, for he was not without decency, and she answered with a grip that tightened like rope swelled by rain. He threw his weight forward. She bent like a reed and did not topple. He shifted and tried to take her ankle. She set her foot, and his balance went from him, as if the floor had turned to mud. He planted himself and set every muscle in his back. She forced him down to one knee. The hall clapped in rhythm. The king raised his hand and ended the match. The guests were given a place at table and fed well, which is to say that insult here did not lead to murder. Thor sat with eyes that measured distances. At dawn, Utgard Loki walked with them outside the walls and told the truth. He said that Skrymir had been himself, and that the knot on the food bag had been bound with a spell. He showed Thor the hill with 3 deep valleys cut into it. Each was made by a blow that would have killed a giant if it had landed full upon a skull. He said that in the hall he had wrapped every contest in illusion, because he would not risk the ruin of his court by letting the Thunderer use his strength without a leash. Loki had eaten against wildfire. Thialfi had raced thought. The horn had been joined to the sea, and Thor had drunk so deep that men later noticed the shoreline pulled back a little and gave the mystery the plain name of tide. The cat had been the Midgard serpent in the shape of a house pet, and when Thor lifted one paw, he had forced the coils that encircle the earth to shift. The old woman was old age. No man at any time has thrown her. Thor grasped the hammer, white-faced with anger. He stepped toward the king to end the tricks with a clean blow. Utgard Loki raised his hand, and the fortress with its high walls vanished like frost under Sunday. The plain lay empty. The air was very clear. Loki and Thialfi stood quiet, understanding that some victories are refusals and some defeats are lessons. Thor saw that he had been measured by illusions because otherwise the ground itself might have broken. He tightened the strap on the hammer and turned west. He had not won a single boast, yet the giants had learned what kind of neighbor lives beyond the boundary forest. In the years after, when skalds told this story by winter light, men nodded and said that power and guile are both needed to keep the Middle Lands. Thor woke and reached for the comfort that always lay within his hand. The bedplace was empty of weight. He groped for the square head and the short haft that fit his palm as if the two had been carved from the same piece of fate. There was nothing. He sat upright, and the hall rang with a silence that only danger can make. A world without the hammer is a house with the door taken from its hinges. He found Loki and said only that the hammer was gone. Loki understood that this was not a matter for a council at leisure. He went to Freya and asked for the falcon cloak that lets a god move like a gust from cliff to cliff. Freya did not ask why. She opened the chest and set the feathered garment in Loki's hands. He shook it out, pulled it close, and the man became a bird with a clever eye. The air took him up, and he flew eastward until the ground below grew broken and bleak, and he saw a burial mound with a figure seated upon it. The giant was Thrym. He braided gold for his dogs and stroked the manes of his horses as if wealth were a kind of grooming. Loki perched and spoke in the neat riddles that pass for courtesy in a hard land. Thrym did not waste words. He said that he had taken Mjolnir and buried it 8 leagues underground where no hand of God would find it. He would return it when Freya came to his hall as a bride. He smiled and named the price as if he had ordered a cart of timber for a new roof. Loki's wings beat once. He turned in the air and went for Asgard like a spark for dry tinder. When Thor heard, he did not answer with a line of poetry. He went to Freya and told her what the giant demanded. She did not pretend to consider. Brisingamen trembled on her breast, and the anger that lifts a sea filled the room. She refused with a force that sent the floorboards to talking. The gods met then in council and sat heavy on their benches. Disaster sat with them. There is wit in Asgard, but not enough wit to meet a world without the hammer. Heimdall spoke, whose sight looks along futures with a steadiness men rarely match. He said that there was a way. Dress Thor as the bride, place the keys of a married woman at his belt, lay Brisingamen on his chest, pull a high veil across his face, and set him beside a maid who can talk fast. Loki said that he would be the maid. Thor grimaced and said that the halls would never finish talking if he wore a bridal veil. Loki answered that the halls would have no one to talk in them at all if Mjolnir did not come home. The company agreed. There was no second plan. They dressed him with care. The goddess Freya lent the necklace. The women of Asgard brought brooches and rings enough to soften even a frame that had thrown down mountains. They hung a ring of keys at the girdle, the sign of a matron whose house is large. They drew the veil close and shaded the eyes that blaze like forge fire. Loki put on a maid's dress and tucked a knife in the folds, because even handmaids should have resources in strange houses. They led the pair to the yard where the goat chariot waited. The wheels rattled, and the sky hardened as they crossed from the known to the borderlands. Thrym's hall was high and raw-edged. He came out to meet his treasure with a grin that had counted all its teeth. He called for benches and meat, and a feast, to crown the bargain that would give him both a goddess and the hammer that blesses a house and a birth and a burial. The giants carried in an ox roasted whole and fish on great platters and vats of mead that smelled of clover and iron. The bride sat with her veil in place and began to eat. She cleared an ox to the bone. She swallowed 8 salmon shiny with fat. She finished every sweetmeat that had been laid in bowls and emptied 3 whole barrels of mead. The hall fell quieter with each course. Thrym shifted on his seat and spoke aside to the maid. He said he had never seen a woman consume so much food without dying of it. Loki bowed and smiled and explained in the mild voice of one who has made a life of explanations. The bride had not touched a bite for 8 nights, he said. So eager was she to come to Jotunheim. She had refused food the way a child refuses sleep on the night before a fair. Thrym nodded. delighted that he was so desired. The moment came for ceremony. Thrym leaned forward to kiss the bride and lifted the veil. He found himself looking into eyes that burned like embers raked in a new wind. He slid back and spoke again to the maid, whose expression still invited confidence and not alarm. The maid said that the bride had not slept for 8 nights for longing, and that her eyes were hot with that longing and with travel. The giants laughed and relaxed and reached for their cups. Thrym called then for the hammer to be brought to seal the blessing of the marriage according to giant custom. Servants came bearing Mjolnir as 4 men might carry a heavy stone that has some holiness. They laid it on the lap of the veiled bride so that the marriage could be hallowed. The bride's hands moved like hawks stooping. The veil came away. Thor stood up inside the wedding dress, and his roar filled the beams. He took the hammer by the short haft that had always known his grip, and he struck Thrym so that the giant's crown shattered like a pond in Thor. He turned and struck the giant's kin where they Saturday. The sister of Thrym had asked for gold from the bride as a morning gift, and Thor gave her what his hands provide. The hall emptied of life in a rush of broken cups and falling benches. Loki threw off the maid's clothes and kept moving, because there are moments when even wit must admit that the argument has passed to other instruments. Thor strode through the doorway with the hammer on his shoulder and the ruin behind him. The chariot waited. The goats snorted and pawed. The road that had been long in fear was short in triumph. The sky loosened, and a first small rain fell, as if to settle the dust. They crossed the boundary, and the wall received them. Brisingamen went back to its owner. The keys were returned to their hooks. Mjolnir hung again on the belt where it belongs. No one in Asgard took up a harp and sang a ballad of Thor in a bridal veil. They laughed later in private over cups, and that laughter did not cheapen the event. It reminded them that courage is not always solemn. The story stood for something the gods do not forget. The hammer hallows as well as harms. It blesses a bed and a threshold and a child in the arms of a mother. When Thrym asked for the hammer as a wedding pledge, he showed that even giants understand its sanctity, though they would twist it to their own gain. The old poem that keeps this tale likes a good joke, but it does not miss the doctrine behind the laughter. It shows that Loki's cunning belongs to order when it is called to the work of restoration. It shows that Thor's appetite and strength are the twin engines that keep the middle world safe. It shows that a hall loses its ease when its central tool is missing, and that the return of that tool restores more than safety. It restores the ability to bless. From that day, men who fastened little hammers under their shirts, and women who asked for a hammer to be laid on the bridal lap, knew that the story had passed into the customs that hold a people together. When the thunder walked again across the sky, the sound carried relief as well as warning. The goats stamped in their stall at night and did not limp. The watchman turned on his tower and breathed a little easier. The maker of songs found his words again, and the fire on the hearth looked like a guest and not a threat. Asgard slept a first easy sleep, and in the morning Thor stood in the yard and turned the hammer over in his hand as if to remind it and himself that they were one thing. Loki's place among the gods was always a contested seat. He had sworn brotherhood with Odin and drank the pledge that binds one life to another, yet his blood runs from the house of giants. His father is called Farboti, his mother Laufey or Nal, and in his company mischief walks as an equal to brilliance. Among the women of the far forest called Ironwood, he kept a bond with Angrboda, whose name speaks of sorrow brought near. From that union came 3 children who are not like other children. Their births read like notes written in the margin of fate. The first is a serpent that will not be measured by any fisher's cord. Jormungandr came small enough to hold in 2 hands, coils cold with the memory of Niflheim. Odin looked once and looked again, and saw not a garden snake but the outline of a world problem. He took the young thing and flung it into the ocean that girdles Midgard. There the serpent found home and food, and a horizon that never ends. It grew long and older and clever, and in time its body stretched around the earth until its snout met its own tail. The sea rose and fell with that slow breathing. Men who fish the deep sometimes speak of a white eye far below their keels, and are careful afterward with oaths. In songs that sailors favor, there is a line about a hammer lifted in a boat and an ox head used for bait. That day lies ahead. For now, it is enough to know that the world serpent has taken its station and that the sea knows its weight. The second child is a wolf born with a king's shoulders. They named him Fenrir, and also Fenris Wolf, and Hrodvitnir in older lists. His paws were too large for youth, and his appetite had no ceiling. The Aesir did not at first slay him. They judged that a foe kept in sight is safer than a foe raised in secret, and they thought to tame him with kindness and close watch. Only Tyr found courage enough to feed him daily. He brought meat in both hands and learned the sound of Fenrir's breath when patience wore thin. The wolf grew as if each rib were a season, and each season doubled. Old prophecies muttered by wise women said that the wolf would break bonds no smith could make, and that his wide mouth would one day close upon the highest god. Around that kennel the air felt strained like a bowstring. The gods did not speak of the day to come. They counted food and sharpened their minds. The third child is a girl whose body tells two truths. Hel is her name. One side of her is living and fair. The other is blue-black as a winter bruise, and still as a churchyard. Odin sent her down and outward to the far root where cold springs rise. She was given a realm and a charge. The realm men call Hel or Helheim, and the charge is to house all who die not by sword or spear, but by age and sickness and sorrow. Her hall is Eljudnir, where cold lamps burn. Old lore gives her dish the name Hunger, and her knife the name Famine. Her bed is called Sick Bed, and her bed curtains are called Bleakly. Her servants Ganglati and Ganglot move slowly as if their joints were made of dusk. At the cave called Knipahelia the hound Garm bays when a new soul comes by, and over the river Gjöll a bridge arches that glows pale as hoarfrost. A maiden named Modgard keeps that crossing and asks the traveller for his name and errand. Beyond stands the gate called Helgrind, and beyond that the long fields without sun where most of mankind abides. It is not a place only of punishment. It is a place of keeping. The sting there is not flame, but memory. The wise notice how the gods answered these births. The serpent they sent to the outermost water, the place that needs a belt if the middle lands are to hold. The wolf they kept inside their own fence under watchful eyes, a decision that cost them sleep and later blood. The girl they enthroned in a necessary office and made her keeper of what most must one day be. These are not random moves. They are an admission that the world contains forces that cannot be rubbed out, only placed where they can do their work without unmaking the rest. Hel's realm shaped the customs of Midgard. Men buried shoes with their dead so the long road would not fall hard on bare feet. They laid a coin, or a knife, or a token in the hand, not to bribe a ferryman of another people, but to carry worth into a country where worth is counted in remembrance. They spoke the name of the dead at the door, and tied a knot in a cord to make grief wait its turn. When a body went to the ship and the flame, folk said the bright ones had called him. When a body went into the earth, they spoke of Hel as a house with a latch that opens for every family. Prophecy ran ahead of these children like shadow before a storm. In the seer's song that Odin bought with rings and attention, we hear of a woman in Ironwood who nurses wolf kindred and sends them out against the sky. The sun and the moon will feel teeth that have learned on bone. The Midgard serpent will lift its head and spill poison into air and water. The great wolf will break what no one thought could break. Hell will open her gate, and an army that never drew a sword in life will march under a pale banner. These are not yet events. They are warnings placed like cairns along a road that the gods already walk. Loki did not boast of these offspring in Asgard. He is a father who does not bring a cradle into the hall. Yet he did not renounce them either. When the gods spoke in private of the children of grief, they spoke also of the bargains they had already made with fate. Odin had traded an eye for sight and a part of himself for the runes. He knew the price of trying to forget what has been foreseen. He therefore set the serpent by the ocean, the girl in her seat, and the wolf under a watch that would soon require more than meat and iron. There is a grave tidiness in this arrangement. The sea has its master coil. The underworld has its queen who keeps the house with stern fairness. The courtyard of the gods has its danger that grows with every feeding. The middle lands continue to plough and to marry and to sing, but the singers begin to flavor their songs with a salt that is not from the shore. They understand that the days are numbered not by clocks only, but by promises and by debts. A game is in play whose board was cut from Ymir's bones, and on that board these three children are pieces that no hand can pass back to the box. The poets, who love lists because lists keep fear in lines, say also that Loki's household holds other lives. Sigyn sits by him and is faithful past ordinary endurance. From that marriage came sons whose names diverge in the sagas, and their fates will be bound to punishments not yet reached. Earlier still, Loki bore Sleipnir when he slipped into the form of a mare and lured away a certain builder's stallion. That tale belongs to craft. These children belong to foreboding. Together, they show that the trickster breeds both helpers and ending signs. So the world settled into a tense balance. The gods kept feast days and judgments, and rode out at dawn to the first route as they always had. In the night, some woke and listened for a far surf that was not water. Tyr fed the wolf and did not speak of the tightness in his chest. Fishermen mended nets and watched the horizon as if a ridge had risen a little where no land is. Women who had washed the dead spoke softer when they sat by the fire afterward. The ash stood and drank at its wells. The squirrel ran his errand of insults. The dragon chewed. The Norns wrote. In such a world, the next wise act is to bind what can still be bound. Fenrir grew as if the seasons themselves were his bones. The meat that fed him was the size of oxen, and the bowls that held his water were troughs cut from single logs. His breath misted even in summer, and his eyes learned the habit of suspicion. A prophecy ran beside him the way a shadow runs beside a rider. It said that this wolf would one day unhouse the highest god. The Aesir chose to watch him rather than hunt him. They told themselves that a danger kept in sight is the safer danger. Only Tyr daily set a hand to the wolf's muzzle and brought food with the calm of a man who has already counted the cost. When Fenrir's paws pressed deeper prints with each passing moon, the gods proposed a game of strength. They had dwarfs forge an iron fetter and named it lading. It was thick as the wrist of a stone cutter and ribbed with cunning. They invited the wolf to test himself upon it. Fenrir opened his mouth in what might have been a smile. He set his legs and let them wind the chain round his body. At the signal, he surged. The lynx sang and burst like rotten ice. Iron pieces lay in the grass, and the wolf shook his mane as a dog shakes rain from its coat. The Aesir feigned wonder and praise as if they had not expected this first victory. They sent again for the smiths, and the dwarfs returned with a second chain heavier by far. They called it Dromi. It was studded and bound with runes that promised stubbornness. Again they suggested a trial, and again Fenrir agreed. He flexed and twisted and found the chain held for a long breath. His eyes narrowed. Then he braced his hind legs, bored his front claws into the earth, and threw himself outward with a violence that cracked stones underfoot. The fetter tore. The last link snapped, and flew into a birch with a sound like a struck shield. The wolf laughed without words. The gods smiled thinly and spoke together in quiet voices. Odin sent secret messengers to Svartalfheim and bade the dwarf masters make a third binding, not of iron, but of things that do not invite strength to answer strength. The dwarfs asked for 6 ingredients that do not belong to ordinary reckoning. They took the sound of a cat's footstep, which is silence made nimble. They took the beard of a woman, which exists only in riddles. They took the roots of a mountain, which lie deeper than guesses. They took the sinews of a bear, which do their work out of sight. They took the breath of a fish, which leaves no trace in the water that carried it. They took the spittle of a bird, which dries before it falls. From these impossibilities they made a ribbon smooth as silk and strong beyond hope. They named it Gleipnir. They said that men would never again hear cats come, nor find women with beards, nor see mountains uprooted, and that bears would keep their strength, and fish swim, and birds sing, because the stuff of those wonders had gone into this one binding. The gods carried Gleipnir to a dark lake named Amsvartnir, and to the island in its middle called Lyngvi. There they spoke to Fenrir as companions who wish to be entertained by a feat that will fill the benches with stories. The wolf sniffed the ribbon. It looked soft. It weighed less than a sash. He felt the chill that tells a hunter when a trap is near. He set his jaws and said that he would not be bound by such a toy unless one of the gods placed a hand in his mouth as a pledge that no treachery was intended. If he could not break the ribbon, he would release the hand. If the ribbon bit and held by magic, he would take his price. Silence fell. No one stepped forward. They looked to Odin, and he did not speak. Thor scowled and stared at the lake. Freyr shifted his weight and studied the grass that found purchase in the thin soil. Then Tyr moved. He had fed Fenrir with his own fingers and had looked into the yellow lamp of that gaze. He knew that good faith sometimes walks with blood. He held out his right hand. The wolf lowered his head and took it between his teeth without pressure. The other gods wrapped Gleipnir around the legs and shoulders and neck of the beast. They cast the loose ends about the rocks. Fenrir tried a modest pull and felt the ribbon tighten. He dug his claws deep and heaved. He snapped and writhed and swelled in rage until the island trembled, but Gleipnir only grew more smooth and more fast. He lay panting at last, and understood that he had been trapped by a thing that did not show strength on its face. His eyes went to Tyr. The god did not draw away. He did not beg. He set his jaw. Fenrir clamped down. The hand came away at the wrist and fell into the heather like a small white stone. They anchored the fetter with a chain called Gelgir to the rock called Geol, and from there to a great boulder named Thwiti, so that no quick mischief could unmake what the dwarfs had made with a long art. They thrust a sword into the wolf's open mouth to hold the jaws apart. The hilt rested on the gums and the point fixed in the palate, and foam poured from Fenrir's lips until it made a river that men afterward called Van, which is to say, hope. He lay there glaring, and the grass around him ceased to grow. The lake drew back from the shore as if in distaste. Birds avoided that sky. Only Tyr looked on him without flinching, for Tyr had already paid and had kept the bargain for all. So the threat within the fence was put under a curb that could not be broken by bellowed rage. The gods returned to their halls with the gait of men who have done what had to be done and will not boast of it. They did not hold a feast. They sat quieter at evening. Tyr wore his sleeve pinned and his smile did not falter. In judgments afterward he was given a greater hearing, because people who have suffered for the peace of others speak with a gravity that is not learned from books. Old lore adds details, as if to fix the binding with pegs of memory. It was the island called Lyngvi, where the wolf was fettered, and the lake Amsvartnir, that looked on without favor. The dwarf ribbon was fair to the eye like summer cloth and deadly to effort. Its name means the open one that tightens. The chain that led away from it took its name from the resounding stone. The boulder that held the last length was named for firmness. The sword that kept the jaws apart turned drool to a stream whose name men mutter when they ask that courage hold one day more. This is how skalds keep a tale from drifting. They bind it to places and to names. The wolf learned and waited. He lay in the heather and watched the clouds move, and his eyes counted years with more patience than any shepherd. He knew that he had not lost only because the gods were cunning. He had lost because he himself had asked for a pledge, and one god had given it without flinching. Such lessons are bitter. Such lessons grow teeth. In the visions that the seeress sold for a high price, there is a passage that says the bonds will one day fall away as if they had been rope cut with a single stroke. The wolf will stand and open his mouth so wide that the lower jaw drags the ground and the upper jaw touches the sky. Fate will go out to meet him, and a son will answer for a father with a boot made from every scrap of leather men ever trimmed from their shoes. For now the island holds. For now the ribbon does not fray. The watchman hears the sound the sword makes between the jaws and knows it is not the sound of triumph, but of time purchased. The gods continue to judge beneath the ash. They still ride in the morning to the root where the Norns bless the bark. They still lay hands on shoulders and decide hard cases. Yet every feast ends with the sense of a door shut on a winter night, and a wind that prowls past looking for a latch left undone. The binding of Fenrir is not reassurance. It is a stay of sentence and a promise to keep the center in repair until the appointed day. Among the shining halls of Asgard, there is one whiter than new snow and cleaner than a priest's hands before prayer. It is Breidablick, the broad gleam, and there Balder held court. No unclean thing could cross its threshold. He was beloved not for power alone, but for the way his presence steadied men. Gentle and fearless, husband of Nanna, father of Forseti who weighs disputes until both parties nod, Balder was the bright center that kept anger from hardening into habit. When he began to dream of death, the benches fell silent. The dreams were clear and cold. He woke speaking names that made even Odin sit straighter. He told of a dark hall down under the roots where a high seat stood prepared and a mead bench was newly washed. He could smell the sharp chill of the place that takes most of mankind. Frigg gathered the gods and spoke without delay. She would remove danger by removing permission. She walked the worlds as only a mother can. She took oaths from fire and from water, from iron and from every metal that remembers the forge, from stone and from earth, from illness and from poison, from beasts that go on foot and from birds that go on wing, from trees and vines and every creeping thing. Each swore to do Balder no harm. When she returned to Fensalir and told what she had done, a weight left the room. The success bred a kind of play. In the field before the hall, the gods made sport of their own safety. They set Balder at the center and cast at him to prove the world had bound itself for love of him. Spears spun and turned aside in the air. Stones arced and fell harmless at his feet. Swords rang flat on the bright mail he wore and left not a scratch. Arrows refused their targets as if ashamed. The benches roared with relief. Even the servants came out to laugh. No one counted this as arrogance. It was thanksgiving in the form of a game. But vows are threads, and threads can be missed. In a wood not far from Fensalir grew a young mistletoe, pale and small, and without the threat that grows obvious in oaks and yews. Frigg had walked past it with a smile, saying that such a child of a plant needed no oath. Loki heard the whole story as a guest in her house and turned the kindness to his use. He had the gift that makes mischief seem like a clever solution until the moment after. He took the shape of an old woman with a shawl drawn close and sat near Frigg's seat, as women do when the house is busy. He asked in a mild voice whether every creature and thing had sworn. Frigg answered that all had promised, except a little mistletoe that was too young to frighten anyone. Loki thanked her for the story with a nod as small as a pin, and went out with his head bowed as if in sympathy. He found the plant on a north-facing trunk and cut it with a careful hand. In his fingers, it hardened from twig to dart. He polished the point on his sleeve and looked for a place to spend it. That day the assembly was at its game again, and all of them joined in except Hode, Baldur's blind brother, who stood apart with his staff and a lonely look. Loki drew near and asked softly why he did not honor Baldur with the rest. Hodra answered that he could not see to throw and that he had no weapon even if he could. Loki placed the mistletoe in his hand and guided his arm. He offered to aim for him so that Hodra could be part of the joy and not its spectator. The kindness was perfect. Hodra cast. The little thing flew straight. It struck Baldur in the breast and went into him as if it had been hunger. He fell as a tree falls when the axe has bitten deeper than the woodcutter guessed. The field stopped breathing. There was no sound at all while the gods ran forward. They touched him and called his name. He did not answer. Frigg dropped to her knees and gathered his head into her lap. Odin stood with his jaw set and his eye as empty as a winter sky. Thor gripped the hammer until the short haft creaked. Someone lifted Hodra's hand and saw what he held and understood. Loki had already stepped back into the crowd. All that had been given by oath was suddenly revealed as loan rather than law. The sun seemed to hesitate in its course. Men later said that day was shorter, and the next night had too much of it. The hall lights guttered and were lit again, and still there was not enough brightness. Nanna stood beside her husband, and her face changed with the change that has only one cause. Forseti, who had always spoken softly and made peace with a word, said nothing at all. In the midst of grief, a will rose. The gods would not let this end be the last word. There were ways to bargain with Hel, whose office is keeping, not cruelty. To bargain, one must go, and to go, one must know the road. Before any embassy could be sent, the rites of honor had to be set in motion. Odin bent and whispered something into the ear of his dead son, words no one else heard and no poet claims to know. Then the company of the High Ones turned to the work that customs require when a light has been put out. The old songs say the earth itself shivered then, and that dreams of a threefold winter ran like frost across the minds of seers. Whether that is true or merely neat craft by later skalds, the truth is heavy enough without ornament. A life that steadied others was gone through a fault so small that a mother had walked past it without worry, and through a malice so clever that it borrowed the hands of a blind man to do its work. The bright age tilted. They bore Baldur to his ship, Hringhorni, the largest that ever tasted salt. It rested hauled high upon rollers and would not stir for any hand. Messengers rode for Hyrrokin, a giantess who keeps her dwelling in the deep forests beyond all farms. She came riding a wolf with vipers for reins. She leaped from the saddle, took hold of the prow, and pushed once. The ship shot forward so fiercely that the rollers sparked and the earth trembled. Thor lifted his hammer to strike her for that affront, but the gods set their hands on his arm and spoke him back from rage. They laid Baldur upon the deck with solemn order. Nanna, his wife, saw the body, and grief went through her like winter through an orchard. She fell, and her spirit went out of her. They set her beside her husband upon the ship. Odin came and laid on the pyre Draupnir, the ring that drops 8 bright copies on the 9th night, as a gift to his son beyond the breath of wind. Frigg sent tokens for Hel's queen to soften the welcome. Freyr led forth the stallion that had carried Balder in peace times, and they placed it on the ship with saddle and harness. Thor hallowed the pyre with the hammer so that the passage would be lawful. A dwarf named Lit ran before his feet. In the heat of sorrow, Thor kicked him into the blaze, and the dwarf perished. Torches found the pitch. Ringhorni went out onto the water burning, and a black line of smoke drew itself across the day. That was the farewell of Asgard to its brightest. There remained the matter of ransom. Hermod, the swift of Odin's sons, asked for Sleipnir. He mounted the grey horse who runs as easily over sea as over field and set out. 9 nights he rode through vales where nothing grows and across slopes where light seems a rumour. On the 10th he came to the river Gjoll, roofed by a sky that does not warm. A bridge arched there that glowed pale. A maiden named Modgud kept the crossing and asked who passed so loud. Hermod named himself and said that he sought Balder. She told him that the dead had crossed the day before and that he would find Hel's Hall down the road and to the north. He rode hard until he reached Helgrind, the gate that most must pass. He touched the flanks, and Sleipnir leaped so cleanly that the iron did not ring. In the hall he found Balder seated in the high place that had been prepared in the dreams. The dead man was unhurt, and the honor about him was plain. Hermod stayed the night. In the morning he asked Hel to send Balder home to those who loved him. Hel's law is keeping and balance. She said that she would release him if all things shed tears for Balder. If even a single creature refused, he would remain. Hermod rose and prepared to ride. Balder gave him messages for his kin and sent also Nanna's gifts for Frigg and for Fulla. Hel placed into Hermod's keeping Draupnir, which had been laid upon the pyre, and told him to return it to Odin. Sleipnir took the gate in a single bound once more, and Hermod made for Asgard with news and with tokens that proved he had stood in the shadowed hall. The gods sent messengers across the worlds. They spoke to men and to giants, to elves of light and of dark, to mountains and to ore veins, to rivers, to beasts, to trees and to grasses, to sickness and to the biting things that creep. One by one they wept for Balder. The stones sweated, the trees let fall leaves before their time, the beasts lowered their heads, the waves darkened. All wept until the company returned by the long road, believing the condition met. On the last day they came to a cave where sat a giantess named Thok. They begged for her tear. She answered that she would weep dry tears at Balder's bier. The living and the dead pleased her alike. Let Hel hold what she has. So she spoke, and nothing could move her. Those who read riddles with an ill will said that Thok was Loki in another skin. Whether that is truth or spite, the refusal served his malice. Because one voice withheld sorrow, Hel's decree stood. Balder would remain. The loss was confirmed by the law that had been offered as a hope. In the halls, the benches began to feel the cold from far places. The hunt for the mischief maker had the clarity of duty. Loki fled Asgard as men flee a fever. He made himself a house on a lonely mountain with 4 doors so that he could look out in every direction. By day he hid as a salmon in a pool that lay near the foot of the cliff. In the evening he sat by the fire and wove a net of fine cord to amuse his impatience. He saw the gods crossing the slope and threw the net into the flames so that it would not betray him. They entered the house and found the ash outlines of a tool they did not know. Kvasir studied the shape and understood what hand had made it. They plaited a net from the ash that was not yet cold and went down to the river. They cast above the pool and walked in a line, drawing the mesh through the water. The fish was clever and dived under the net and lay in the gravel. They weighted the lead line and cast again. The fish sprang for the sea. Thor waded out and stood below the cataract with his hands. The salmon passed, and Thor gripped the tail. The fish writhed and almost slipped the hold, but the grip was too sure. That is why salmon are narrow at the tail. They brought Loki out of the river and stripped him of disguise. They bound him and took him to a cave steep with shadows. There they set the punishment that the story remembers whenever the ground moves underfoot. They took his sons. One was named Nafi, and one was named Vali. They turned Vali into a wolf. He tore his brother in a frenzy, and the gods took the entrails of Nafi and used them for cords. They bound Loki to 3 stones, one under shoulders, one under loins, one under knees, and when the cords hardened they became like iron. Skadi came and took a venomous snake and fixed it above his face so that the drops would fall on his brow. Sigyn, his wife, came and sat and held a bowl to catch the poison. When the bowl fills, she must rise to pour it away, and in those moments the drops strike. The pain is so sharp that Loki twists and the whole earth shudders. This is the beginning of earthquakes in the lore of the North. So Loki remained. Balder remained. Nanna remained. Draupnir was returned to the hand that had given it. Hel kept the gates shut by the word that all must weep. Asgard kept a chair empty and a grief that did not fade. The gods had taken a traitor and had made the punishment fit the measure of his injury. The world learned a new sound, the small clink of venom into a bowl, and the sudden groan of the ground when mercy cannot keep pace with pain. Prophecy grew louder in the minds of those who listen. A river of delay had been purchased, but the sea that waited beyond it still existed. After Balder's pyre, and after the binding of Loki, the world began to lean toward its ending. The omens did not shout at first. They gathered. The ash groaned more often, and the Norns poured their white water with a gravity that made even gods fall quiet as they entered the council field. In Midgard, old women woke from dreams of wolves running along the ridge of the sky, and men who had never feared the sea began to muffle their oars. These were the first thin ripples from a far storm. Then came the long winter the seeress had promised for a high price. Fimbulwinter did not follow the calendar. It arrived with snow from every quarter and wind that shaved the skin. It lasted through 1 whole year, and then another, and then a third, without a summer to loosen it. Frost laid iron on doors. Crops failed in the dark soil. The kindling box stood empty because no one dared cut the last grove. The worst losses came not from cold but from hearts that forgot kinship. Brothers took up axes against brothers. Fathers and sons counted old slights and called them debts. Guests were met at the threshold with a hand on a knife. It was as if the warmth had been bled from courtesy as well as from cattle. The heavens gave their own witness. For ages too, wolves had paced the sky and kept the sun and the moon honest. The hunters were named Skoll and Hati. During Fimbulwinter they closed the distance. The sun dimmed and went out in a sudden bite. The moon followed. Stars shook free from their places and vanished like sparks carried off by the wind. Day and night lost their meaning. In that deeper dusk, 3 roosters crowed to wake the armies of both sides. In Asgard, the golden cock Gullinkambi shouted on the roof of Valhalla. In Jotunheim, a bird called Fjalar answered from a red wood. Down in the shadows of hell, a soot-colored rooster cried to the hosts that remember the taste of air. The earth answered with quake after quake. Mountains split along faults older than the gods. Caverns opened like mouths. Beneath the roots of the world, the old eater worked faster. Havagelmir boiled with snakes. The bonds of many things failed. The hound Garm tore loose from the cave called Gnipperhellir, and his howling made hall timbers groan. On the island in the Black Lake, the ribbon that had held the wolf exploded without a sound. Fenrir rose and stretched. His jaws gaped so wide that the lower struck the ground, and the upper scraped the sky. In the girdling sea, the Midgard serpent began to move. Its coils chafed, its body heaved, and the ocean climbed its length in great hills of water. Venom smoked on its tongue, and the breath that rose from its throat turned to a cloud that poisoned the air. Muspelheim at last stepped forward into the story it had been saving. From the south, the rider Surt led a company of fire giants, whose armor shone like a forge floor. In his hand a sword burned brighter than the surface of the Sunday. He set his feet upon the rainbow bridge and marched. Bifrost cracked and fell away in pieces. From the north, black sails gathered on a ship that no living carpenter had built. It was Naglfar, the nail ship made in hell from the parings of the dead. From that shore, Hrym came at the helm, though other poets sing that Loki took the steering oar and piloted the vessel through fields of ice. The point is not the argument, but the army. Every plank creaked with the weight of those whom hell had kept. Along other roads, those same dead marched overland behind Loki with faces white and unsmiling. The giants from Stone Country left their citadels. The frost that had been their ally now served as bridge and banner. Trollkind, Wolfkind, and hosts from the Rim came to a place long named for this meeting. Yggdrasil shook to its crown. The eagle that watches from the highest bough screamed. The 4 stags stamped and tore at bark. Down among the roots, Nidhogg tore and tore as if he could drag the tree into the dark by hunger alone. Dwarfs stood in their doorways and moaned in the language of stone. In Valhalla benches rattled, and spears in their racks beat together like hail on a roof. The Einherjar, who had practiced each day and died each evening to be whole again, rose with their shields. Valkyries tightened the buckles on their horses. In the watchtower by the end of the broken bridge, Heimdall lifted the horn no one wants to hear and put it to his mouth. The note that went out was as old as the ash and as clear as first water on rock. It traveled all the roads that bind the realms. Every being understood. Odin made one last visit to council. He rode Sleipnir to Mimir's well and bent his head over the water where his eye looks back at him from the deep. He did not ask for victory. He asked to be utterly awake. Then he went home and buckled on his armor that is black as a raven's back and took up the spear Gungnir. He called to his sons and to his fostered heroes and to the friends of his house, and together they marched out of the Golden Gate. The field waited where all songs had placed it. The name is Vigrid, and in old measures it is said to be 100 leagues across. There was room for everything. From one side the gods and the chosen dead and the Vanir came in order. From the other side, the fire from the south, the frost from the north, the ocean carried anger from the rim, the serpent lifted rings the size of hills, and the wolf trod a path that killed grass with every step. The air was so saturated with omen that even the bravest kept their voices low. Some stories tell that before the ranks collided, a final sign caught the eye of the living. In the new world of shadow, a hall appeared that few had seen. Light spilled from the doors of a place called Gimel, a promise made long ago. It did not halt the battle. It was a lantern held up to a road already chosen. On the other horizon, a hall roofed in serpents showed its teeth and poison rained from the rafters. This too was a sign of what comes of oaths broken without shame. Between promise and refusal, the hosts advanced. The last arrangements were made in moments that felt like days. Tyr tested the strap on the stump of his right arm and smiled in a way that steady men understand. Freyr stood without his good sword and took up a horned weapon fit for a huntsman. Thor weighed the hammer and drew in a breath like a man who has set his feet on rock. Heimdall rested his hand on the horn that had done its work and waited for a face he knew. Vidar stood apart silent and looked at his boot where leather cuttings had been sewn through ages into a shoe that is more fate than garment. Honir cast lots and read what he already suspected. Frigg looked toward a shadow that was once a child and said nothing that anyone could hear. It is right that the saga pauses here. The reckoning is upon them. The pieces stand as the poets placed them after long memory and careful talk. The winter has done its work. The hunters have eaten the lights of the sky. The dead have left their quiet, and the living have left their halls. The tree shakes from root to crown, and the horn's note still lingers on the edges of hearing. Now all that remains is the clash that ends an age and begins the tale that follows it. Ranks met on the plain that old verses measure at 100 leagues. A cold light lay on mail and on antlers fixed to helmets. From one side came the Aesir and Vanir with the Einherjar, the chosen dead who had trained each noon for this hour. From the other came Frost and Fire, Stone and Serpent, Wolf and the restless hosts from Hell. The ash shivered above them, and the ground answered with a dull sound like a drum buried under turf. Odin rode first with ravens wheeling and wolves at his stirrups. Gungnir levelled in his hand, and the point marked a straight line to the widest mouth in any song. Fenrir loomed, mane bristling with sparks from the broken bridge and eyes like winter stars. The spear flew. The wolf came through it, and the shaft shattered. Odin struck again, and the great jaws closed. The All-Father went down without a cry. For a moment, the field seemed to pause as if a wind had missed a beat. Vidar moved then, the silent son whose patience had never been counted until this day. He stepped into the shadow of the wolf and set his thick shoe upon the lower jaw, a boot sewn through ages from every scrap of leather men had trimmed from their footwear. He took hold of the upper jaw with his hand and tore until bone creaked and the throat opened. In other tellings, he drives a sword into the heart while the boot pins the jaw. Each version keeps the same truth. Vidar avenged his father and stood with blood about his knees and did not speak. Thor meanwhile faced the Midgard serpent. Jormungandr lifted coils that were the size of hills and vomited black venom that hissed when it touched shield or stone. Thunder walked with the hammer. The sky shook. The snake's head reared and came down, and Mjolnir smashed it so that light flashed in the brains of men who were not looking toward the fight. The serpent died, and the sea fell back from the rims it had reached. Thor took 9 steps on a ground that turned strange underfoot, and his face whitened with the poison that had entered him. He fell with his hand still on the short haft, and the hammer lay quiet beside him, as if it, too, understood the cost. Tyr met the hound that had broken from Gnipperhellir. Garm's coat was spiked with frost, and its breath burned like fever. They closed and tore. The god who had once given his right hand for a promise now gave the rest for the keeping of the field. Garm fell and Tyr fell. The place where they died was left bare of grass by agreement between the two, for courage honors courage, even when the mouths that held it are full of blood. Freyr stood before Surtur with a hunter's horn and a weapon that shone but was not his best. Once he had sent his sword away as a bride price and had not called it back. He thrust and parried, and the blaze from the fire giant's blade threw red over his face. Surt pressed, and Freyr went down, and the flames showed no pity. This is the lesson he leaves behind. Gifts given in season return as honor. Gifts given without thought return as hunger. Heimdall and Loki found each other at last on broken ground near the heap of fallen shields. The watchman had blown his horn, and the sound still rang in the bones of men. The trickster had slipped his bonds when the earth shook, and had led the dead with a calm face that did not belong to a friend. They closed, and the clash looked small beside wolf and serpent and sword of the south, yet the tale insists on it. They wounded each other deeply, and each fell. Silence closed over their quarrel, and the field moved on. Njord had gone back to Vanaheim at the first sign that the age was turning. Freya took her share of the slain to Folkvang, and did not count faces only, but deeds and the grace with which duty had been borne. Hoenir cast lots and foresaw enough to keep his footing where many slipped. Frigg watched, and if any word left her mouth, the wind took it at once. Over all this, Surt swung his blade. Fire leaped like a pack slipping leashes. The plain became a long ember. The sky split and fell away like old bark from a tree. Mountains cracked. Rivers boiled. The pillars of the world gave way, and the seas ran over the edges of the story. Bifrost had already failed, and now the boardsmen had walked since the first winter came apart. Dwarfs groaned in stone doorways, and the stone began to flow. At the ash, the eagles screamed, and the dragon at the root bit, and sap ran like grief. The crown burned, and the trunk smoked, and the leaves curled. The three women at the well did not lift their bowls again, for there was no bark left to mend. To the north, Naglfar cut a line across the last waters and ran aground on a shore that had forgotten its name. Hrym stood at the prow and saw a fire that was no sunrise. In the south, the sword of Surt swelled until it filled the firmament as far as a man can see with eyes closed. The last cries ended and heat took the rest, and the wind rose once, and then there was no wind. Old stanzas add a bitter close. Nidhogg came flying from the dark with dead men in his claws, and a stain upon his teeth, and found nothing living to fear him. The world sank. The waves folded it and smoothed it, and the stars that had fallen lay cold in a night that had no room for maps. That is how the poets end the age. They do not blink or soften. They say simply that all that could burn, burned, and all that could drown, drowned, and the great game in the old house was finished. Yet within the smoke and the sea there remained a promise that had not been spent. A hall of light had shown itself to men who still breathed, and a word had gone out that not every seed dies under ash. The final work of Surtur was also a clearing. The last sound was not a scream but a long hiss as water met iron. In that quiet something like a breath gathered, so the elder singers say, and the dark remembered dawn. Smoke thinned. Ash settled on a sea as calm as a held breath. From that quiet a green lifted its head. Grass crept first, a pale film on slopes that had been cinders. Then birch and rowan pricked the ground with hopeful stems. Rivers ran again, clear this time, and their sound did not carry fear. Over a westward ridge, an eagle rode the spray of a fall and searched the pools, as it had done in the days before men remembered counting. The world had ended with fire and flood, and yet the same old world, washed and sharpened, began to speak. The sun rose again, not the old sun that had been hunted down by a wolf, but her daughter, equally bright, who took her mother's path. Poets say that Sol had hidden the child before the chase was won, and that when the sky reopened, the young one stepped forward with a calm step, and the chariot remembered how to move. Day returned without apology. Night returned with a kinder face. Time found its measure, as if it had been a lost livestock bell, and now rang again from a familiar neck. On a hill whose name had survived, the burning Idavol survivors gathered. They were not many, but they were enough. Vidar came from the place where the wolf had died, and his boot was heavy with a deed that will never be retold without a held breath. Vali stood with him, the son who had been born for vengeance, and had fulfilled it cleanly. Modi and Magni arrived leading Thor's goats, and carrying the hammer that had outlived venom and thunder. They had found Mjolnir on the quiet field where its owner fell, and now the tool held the weight of two futures rather than one. Hoenir came slow and grave, a staff in his hand, and those who watched him said that he still heard hints from far water. From the ways of shadow came Balder and Hodra together, reconciled at last, released when the old law loosened with the breaking of almost everything else. The sight of those brothers standing shoulder to shoulder steadied the air. They looked upon the field where once they had set the benches of their councils, and they smiled as men smile when they step back into a house after a hard winter's absence. In the grass, they found bright pieces, the golden game tokens of the first days. No one had buried them. Time had misplaced them. Now the earth gave them back, as if to say that play is part of rule, and that the old delight in craft and contest must begin again with clean hands. The survivors laughed, and it was the first sound since the battle that did not carry a remnant of smoke. The land itself promised better behavior. Fields bore without plough, ears of grain filled without a scythe worrying their necks. Fish moved in rivers as if the past had been a fever dream. Wind came in from sea with the smell of salt and not of ash. The harsher corners of the old world were not erased, but they seemed less eager to prove a point. A man could walk from wood to meadow and not look over his shoulder at every third step. Out beyond men and gods, a small story had kept itself safe. In a thicket called Hodmimis Holt, a pair of humans had hidden while the sword of Surt scorched and the sea rose. They were Lif and Lifthrasir. Their names speak of life and the one who clings to life. Morning dew fed them when there was nothing else to eat. When the breathing of the earth calmed, they stepped out under the new sun and were not afraid. From their hunger and their gladness, a people began again. They did not find empty lessons. They found berries and a stream and a place to make a fire that would be watched more carefully than the fires of former days. The halls of the afterworld arranged themselves anew. On high, a hall called Gimli shone with a light that is not borrowed. It waits for the righteous, a roof where truth is ease rather than labor. On a wide plain, a hall called Brimir offered ale that did not sour and company that did not grow thin. In the dark o'er hills, a place called Sindri gleamed for those who love craft and steady work. But not every old house was improved by mercy. Nastrond remained, its walls flayed from the backs of oathbreakers. Through those ribs, poison still dripped. There, the names of the treacherous were spoken, and the speaking was a sentence. It was a warning preserved among comforts. The world tree had suffered beyond telling, yet from the char along its trunk there came thin leaves, and from its crown a new whisper ran down the centuries that were just being born. The wells did not forget themselves. Erd remained memory. Verdandi remained the present that flowers and fades in the same breath. Skuld remained the dew that comes on quiet feet. They tended the bark with their shining clay, and with water drawn from a depth that had not dried even when the stars fell. Men who claim that fate was erased do not listen well. Fate was repaired, and its edges smoothed where they had cut like glass. A question rises whenever a tale gives you dawn after ruin. What of the old enmities? The poems glance toward the horizon and do not pretend more certainty than they own. They say that Nidhogg still flies once with a body in his claws and blood on his teeth. Then the verses stop, either because the singer wished to end with a shiver, or because warning must live alongside hope if hope is to stay honest. Better to say that the new age will have its labors, and that the labors will be worth the song. Odin did not walk in that morning. His memory did. Men set a spear on a wall and said, "This is for the man who paid for truth." They did not worship absence. They kept counsel, which amounts to the same honor. Thor's steps did not shake the new floors, but the hammer on the belt of his sons set a pattern of protection that needed no explanation. Freya's smile was not seen at the first ploughing, yet the rain came on time, and the barns learned their old tricks. Baldur's seat in Breidablick glowed, and in his presence people spoke a shade more kindly and let silence have its proper turn. Hodra's hand rested on the rail, and none doubted that justice could be blind and still exact. Tyr was missing from the circle, but when the first lawstone was raised, his name was cut deep on it, because courage in the service of fair measure cannot be buried under ash. Among men, a few customs from the time before, the time after remained. A bride asked for the hammer to bless her bed. A craftsman scored a strip of wood with those small strokes that turn chance aside. A sailor poured a mouthful of ale into the river and asked it to be a road rather than a ditch. Genes carried memories the way soil carries seeds. A scold told the children the old tales and did not tidy the endings. He added a last lesson. When the world ends, keep your eyes open. When the world returns, keep your word. By slow degrees, the place of councils filled with speech that did not need to shout. A new company learned to sit on Idavol and to send riders from the first route with judgments that could stand a winter. They counted that a good day is won when the game pieces of gold are put away because work has gone well, and a better day is won when the pieces come out and everyone has time for play. They did not search for perfection in the shape of men. They kept balance instead, which was what the old gods had aimed at when they poured water on bark at morning. So the world remade itself along the lines of an older plan but with a kinder light. Corn ripened without debt. Calves stood without fear. A smith smiled at a small straight seam that would outlast his hand. A widow stood by a river and spoke the name of a husband and did not feel the cold of hell at her back. A child asked why the summer smells of honey, and someone answered that once upon a time a tree survived and 3 women would not let it die. A world can die and rise again, but stories do not survive by chance. They travel in mouths and on wood and stone, and they accept the changes that time demands so that the core may endure. After the ash cooled and green returned, memory became the last craft the North would practice with full devotion. What follows is not a list of texts only. It is the map of how a people kept the gods within reach and how the gods in turn shaped the habits of that people. Before any vellum, there were voices. Skalds stood in smoky halls with ice at the eaves and turned deeds into song. They taught listeners to hear a ship as the horse of the sea, to hear gold as serpent bed, to hear blood as the mead of the sword. Such kennings are not riddles for sport alone. They are a discipline that binds many layers of tale into single lines. Bragi Boddason is named as an early master. Egil Skallagrimsson carved runes to heal and to curse, and then sang over his work so that both sound and stroke would hold. In this way, story and spell walked together without shame. Runes themselves kept part of the house. The elder Futhark, and later the younger Futhark, cut along lintels and grave markers, and on amulets worn close to the skin. A short plea shows often, Thor sanctify. On one stone a little hammer is carved where Christians would place a cross. On another, a charm twists like a small river along the edge of a memorial and promises help to the one who reads it aloud without stumbling. These objects are not myths written long. They are doorways. Through them the larger tales breathe. Some scenes were pressed into gold that thin hands could hold. Little foils called Gullgubber show paired figures meeting in a ritual embrace. Scholars see in them the memory of Vanir rites, a blessing enacted in miniature that keeps field and house in good measure. Iron plates from the island smithies show a one-eyed figure and a bent-backed trickster and a strong man with a square-headed tool. A whetstone from Snaptun carries a face whose lips are sewn. Fireside ash has kept that image when many polished halls have fallen. Stone carried more pictures. The picture stones of Gotland show a man fishing from a boat with an ox head for bait and a coil rising from the dark. The Gosforth Cross in the north of England shows a struggle with a serpent and a wolf and a rider on a strange horse. Christian carvers set their faith upon that shaft, and yet the old fights are there, weathered but legible, a reminder that stories overlap when people share winters. Temples stood while the old cult held sway. Adam of Bremen tells of a great house at Uppsala with walls that shone and a grove thick with fear. Sacrifices were made there on a cycle that kept kinship with season. In Iceland, the law speaker once lay under a cloak and decided that one land should have one law so that families would not war forever. After that day, men could still make private offerings in barns and at sea rocks, but the public rites were ended. The word that ended them did not end the stories. When cold and fire had spent their rage upon the plains of myth, it fell to scribes to carry memory on. In Iceland, a long-lived island without kings, men wrote in a language that matched their speech. A thin book that we call the Codex Regius gathered the poems of seers and insult feasts and wagers with giants, and the say-so of kings who will not yet be born. In those leaves you hear the Velva foretell the long winter and the high fire. You hear Odin boast of the spells he learned on the tree. You hear a dwarf list the names of night and day until dawn shows in the door. The book itself carries a quiet wonder. It arrived late to our hands after years hidden, and the gap in its leaves is like a missing plank in a familiar bridge. We cross anyway because the river must be crossed. Another book set out to teach poets their craft and to save old names from confusion. Snorri Sturluson wrote of High One and just as High and Third in the guise of a friendly manual. He explained why the sea can be called Aegir's Mead, why a corpse can be called the Hawk's Share, why a king can be called Tree of Rings. He told how Thor once lifted a cat that was more than a cat, and how he once drank from a horn that was more than a horn. He told why a certain giantess rode a wolf with snakes for reins and shoved a ship into the sea with one push. He begins with a tale that calls the gods men from Asia who dazzled the north with tricks and clever talk. That prologue pleases bishops, but the rest of the book refuses to forget what the people knew. It preserves the quarrels and the courtesies that make a pantheon more than a pageant. Not all memory lives in ink. Days of the week still speak the old names in lands far from the fjords. Tuesday for Tyr and his single-handed fairness. Wednesday for Odin and his hunger for costly counsel. Thursday for Thor, whose hammer steadied barns and borders. Friday for a goddess of love and foresight, whose name is spelled more than one way in the south and the north. Place names keep witness where men have farmed for 1,000 years. Fields and groves are still called the sacred space of Freya, the sanctuary of Thor, the meadow of Odin. A stone on Frozen names a man who raised a bridge, and then says plainly that he baptized the people of the island. On that little text, the two ages shake hands. Laws tug at memory and shape it. The old codes from the West Fjords urge fairness at the thing yet do not hide that a feast to the gods once stood beside the court. Later codes forbid the blood of sacrifice as a public rite and fine those who keep the old seasons. Yet even as the law changed, poets wrote, not to defy, but to explain. They kept what was worth keeping. They set the stories in a past that felt safely far and yet near enough to blush the cheek or to stiffen the back when justice is named. Heroic families carried the divine tales forward by analogy. A dragon horde teaches that greed sleeps with its eyes open. A doomed ring teaches that gifts must be given with measure. A Valkyrie teaches that choice has a face and a voice, not a blind roll of dice. The Volsung poems do not always bring the gods on stage, and yet the stage belongs to them. The shape of fate in those lines is the same shape Asiris sings when she looks from under her hood across the ages. Folklore kept other doors ajar. In winter, folk speak of the wild hunt that tears across the night with dogs and riders. A tall one with a wide hat leads them. Children are told to come in when the wind turns that certain way. At midwinter, now called Christmas by most, old names still stir under the new. Yule fires burn, and a bearded gift-bringer walks over snow. Wise men do not insist on straight lines where lives are curved by cold and hope. Traditions fold. Archaeology finds the crumbs that hands drop without meaning to. A child's wooden toy hammered into mud at a ferry landing. A whalebone plaque scratched with a tiny man and a coil. A brooch with a ring that might be a sun or might be a symbol known only to the woman who wore it. These are not proofs that this or that story is fact. They are proof that people carried meanings in their pockets and pinned them to their clothes because meanings are warmth. At the end of the greatest poem, the seeress tells of halls that wait for the worthy, and then speaks in a single breath of a dragon that flies with bodies in his claws. She leaves us there, between promise and warning. That balance is the heart of this religion of stories. The gods are brave and fallible. They make oaths and sometimes pay more than they planned. They die and return, and the world mends and then must be mended again. The telling asks two things only. Remember, act as if your memory mattered. So the North remembers. On the tongue in kennings that turn a ship into a stallion and a wave into a wall. On stone in runes that bid a god to protect a traveler. In books copied by men who served a new altar yet loved old skill. In place names and weekdays and proverbs. In the hush that takes a room when winter speaks of itself with wind. The story began with a gap and a drip and a cow and a giant and three brothers who made a world from the body of a threat. It ends, for now, with children stepping out of a thicket into a light that belongs to them, with friends returning from hell and smiling like men who have forgiven the night, and with a hammer placed once more in a careful hand.